Welcome to the second day of the International Conference on Religion, State and the Law, which will be kicked off by a panel this morning, which seeks to engage and reflect on gender and religion, on the symbolism of female sexuality, and on how to think and rethink the role of gender in religion. Before we get started and before I'll introduce you to our distinguished guest speakers today, I'll kindly ask you, if you want to engage with the speakers, please use the Q&A sections. You can post your questions there and I'll pass them on to the speakers. Our two speakers will speak for around 20 minutes. Afterwards, we will have 10 minutes per speaker for a discussion. I really engage the participants or ask the participants to engage and ask their questions. We have two distinguished speakers this morning. The first one is Dr. Dina El-Omari. She's the project leader at the Cluster of Excellence, Religion and Politics at the University of Münster since October 2019. There she's leading an independent research project entitled The Ambiguity of Islamic Emancipatory Discourses in Past and Present. She completed her habilitation process in May 2021 with the habilitation thesis Das koranische Menschenpaar in Schöpfung und Eschatologie, Versuch einer literaturwissenschaftlichen Kommentierung. I'm sorry, I didn't translate that very long title into English. The habilitation is published by Herder in autumn 2021. Today, Dr. El-Omari will talk about To Whom Belongs the Female Body? Critical Reflections on Male Authority over the Female Body. Dina, the floor is all yours. We are very much looking forward to your lecture. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction and thank you very much for the invitation. Well, I'm very happy to talk today about the androcentrism of religious norms and yes, a perspective on the female body. As we can see, the language and the perspective used in both Islamic jurisprudence and the religious practice of Muslims are clearly androcentric, with the different areas of Islamic law and those or religious practice often speaking about women as objects. And this leads to significant restriction to a woman's right to self-determination, especially in regard to how the female body is perceived. Although the various Islamic countries like Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, Indonesia, and so on have made attempts of varying intensity to adapt regulation to the context of people's life as part of processes have become evident time and as processes of modernizing and adapting Islamic law as codified law, the limits of these processes have become evident time and again. On the one hand, processes of negotiation and the accompanying legislation are only fruitful in most Islamic countries where no fixed and immutable rules and norms of Sharia exist, making possible an independent interpretation. But in turn, this is only possible, and it is only possible with the main sources for deriving the religious norms of Islamic law, and that means of the Quran and the Hadith, the speeches or the speak of the Prophet. The main problem here is the adherence to these sources as divine or prophetic legal texts that are to be understood in a purely literal way. A historical critical interpretation of those within Islamic exegesis are now increasingly demanding, has so far found little acceptance, which is also due to the lack of communication between these two disciplines. That means there is no communication between Islamic law and exegesis. For example, contemporary Quranic exegesis is already familiar with forms of interpretation that highlight gender equality, but these are barely considered in Islamic law because the two main sources themselves, that means Quran and Hadith, have traits that are sometimes androcentric, but also misogynistic, interpreting them literally and outside their temporal context ensures that a patriarchal understanding of gender roles is taken to be God-given, and those are historical. On the other hand, the underlying understanding of female sexuality in Islamic theology has doubly negative and highly paradoxical paradoxical connotations. Female sexuality is considered dangerous and has a potentially destructive character for society, since a woman's unrestrained desire for sexuality arouses desire in men. As a result, she is depicted as being actively aggressive, the means of regulation being marriage on the one hand and wheeling and gender segregation on the other hand. At the same time, through Islamic scholars emphasize the need for a woman always to satisfy the sexual needs of her husband, meaning that she is portrayed in this context as passive. Both the treatment of the sources and the underlying understanding of female sexuality have inevitable consequences for the religious norms derived from the sources, and thus also for the lives of Muslim women. Although a rigid enforcement of how gender rules are understood varies from context to context, the androcentric perspective remains in many laws, but also legal opinions, means fatwa. This has the consequence that while improvement for women have been seen in the different Islamic countries and contexts in recent years, a woman's right to self-determination is still severely restricted, since a fundamental change in the perception of gender in the sense of rejecting women's over-sexualization has barely taken place. What is therefore needed above all is a methodological shift with regard to how the two main sources of Islamic law are treated, a shift away from an historical towards from a ahistorical towards a historical understanding, so that they can yield religious norms that do justice to be claimed both of gender equality and women's empowerment. So now I would like to focus in my presentation on 2 points. First, I would like to talk about the objectification of the female body in Islamic law, using the example of the term fitna, that means chaos, which is produced by the female body. And second, I would like to give an example how we can deal with the main sources in Islamic law today, and those to show a new textual understanding that highlights gender equality. Let's talk first about the female body in Islamic law and religious practice on the example of fitna. Legal and religious literature, but also Muslim societies, are marked by a clear contradiction regarding female sexuality. At the same time, the basic attitude of Islam towards human sexuality is in general is positive, since from a theological perspective, there is nothing reprehensible per se about the expression of human sexuality. This framework evaluates instincts naturally, bestowing upon them a positive or negative connotation depending on the activity. If they are regulated by marriage, for example, or for fear of God, for example, then they have a positive effect on people and society. If they are uncontrolled, though they can lead to destructive activities, and those harm the social order. The well-known Islamic scholar Al-Ghazali dealt in his the revival of the religious science already in detail in the 12th century with the issue of sexuality. His comments are still relevant today, since he set the course of discussion and did much to shape Islamic ideas about human sexuality. This is particularly evident in his use of the term fitna, which actually means something like test or conflict, but which Al-Ghazali applies to human sexuality, or the desire for it, in his use of the term, to describe the chaos that can result from temptation and its uncontrolled realization. As Irene Schneider aptly notes, this link between sexuality and fitna, that means chaos, not only becomes the central idea in Islamic discourse on gender, it is also very much related to female sexuality. For the unbridled sexual appetite imputed to the female sex, as well as the female arts of seduction, pose an extraordinary challenge to the male sex, which could lead to chaos and must therefore be regulated by divine law. This fear of chaos has resulted, on the one hand, in norms such as gender segregation and veiling for women, and on the other hand, in a transfer to women of the characterizing dichotomy halal-haram, permitted, prohibited. What the androcentric language and perspective very quickly make clear is that the woman is perceived as a pure object. She is halal, that means permitted for the man when she marries her. She is haram forbidden for him when she is menstruating or postpartum. This takes us to the flip side of female sexuality. For while the unmarried woman is portrayed as being potentially aggressively active in terms of her sexuality, Muslim scholars mainly paint a different passive picture of her within the marital union. She is obligated to be sexually available to her husband whenever he demands this of her, since men have a stronger sexual need than women. This is the argument. This obviously contradicts the idea of female sexuality with regard to unmarried women. Although El-Ghazali points out that it is man's task to woo the woman before the sexual act and to satisfy her during the act, this certainly does not mean that the wife can refuse the man, since doing so would have practical consequences for her and spoil her relationship with God. According to prophetic tradition, for example, the angels would curse her, or she would suffer God's displeasure. Religious arguments are therefore used at this point to prevent or counteract a woman's refusal. As for the legal dimension, it is also apparent that most legal scholars still expect the wife's sexual docility to be the basis of the husband's financial support. That means he can withdraw his support if she does not fulfill her duty. This is, of course, problematic in contexts where women are financially dependent on men and need permission from their husband to work, such as in Saudi Arabia. This obligation is also clear in current legal text. For example, paragraph 36 of the Egyptian personal status law, which is strongly shaped by the most important Islamic institution, Al-Azhar. There we read, "It is not obligatory to pay the wife maintenance if she refuses without good reason to do what she must legally do for her husband." What she must legally do is derived in turn from, among other things, the hadith, which oblige her to have coitus and which form the basis for the establishment of religious norms. In contrast, the wife has virtually no chance of redress should the husband, for example, refuse or neglect her. Also, he is called upon to satisfy her sexuality. Unlike the wife, if she refuses sex, the husband usually does not face any consequences at all if he does. In Egyptian personal status law, she can only obtain a divorce if the husband swears that he has now approached her physically for 4 months. Even in this case, though her fate depends on the husband, since it is his word that is deciding, this is a deciding factor for allowing the divorce. These examples do, of course, not cover the entire field of Islamic jurisprudence. Rather, they are intended to exemplify the prevailing spirit when it comes to the treatment of the female body and the woman herself as an object determined by others. We should also note that Islamic law is not a uniform construct and that some Islamic countries have certainly made attempts at modernizing in recent years. These attempts often being initiated by women and young movements, as well as in part by male feminists. Especially the latter also campaigned of men's own interest. However, since they demand gender equality as a reaction to what they consider to be the unjust obligation to the family's soul's provider. Tunisia has made particularly rapid progress in recent years as part of such attempts at modernization and has been able to introduce the most significant reforms and changes. Other Islamic countries, though, continue to display a clear androcentric perspective and can often only report minor progress, such as the option of divorce in Egyptian personal status law, as I already mentioned before. One of the main problems with these slow processes is that they often tackle only the symptoms, but not the causes. This can also be seen in a recent campaign initiated by Al-Azhar in Egypt in July 2020 that calls open preachers to condemn as immoral and criminal the sexual harassment of women, regardless of how they are dressed. The reason for this campaign lay in the numerous assaults and acts harassment perpetrated on women, a problem that is at its worst among the Islamic country in Egypt. What seems quite revolutionary at first sight also lays bare the deep contradiction at the heart of the debate. Since that other announcement was followed by the postscript, we can read here, the question of how women dress in Islam is a matter decided by Sharia, which is supported by the majority of Muslim jurists and scholars. This majority says that virtue in dress is prescribed by law and that Sharia permits only the face and hands to be uncovered. This not only weakens the previous condemnation, it also clearly shows that it's not the actual problems that are addressed, but merely the symptoms. What is lacking here is a critical perspective on the religious sources, as well as the willingness to reject completely both every form of objectification with regard to women and narratives and norms that result in the over-sexualization of the sexes. This could also certainly be done with the support of theology. First, by using the Quran itself to define the highest maxim in gender relation as being gender equality, and those establishing within the Quran the coming of age of woman as a subject. And second, by establishing a historical awareness with regard to the two main sources, the Quran and the Hadith. Let us now turn to the treatment of the sources. And this will be the second part now on the example of one verse, because we don't have so many time. So I will focus now on the verse 222. And we can say that the Quran is the most important source for deriving religious norms, with verses 287 and 222 to 223 being particularly important with regard to women's right of self-determination concerning her own body. For the androcentric language of these verses serves as a basis for the heteronomy of the female body already mentioned, especially in Islamic jurisprudence. A literal understanding of the Quran makes the heteronomy not only ahistorical, but also divinely legitimate. A contemporary interpretation of the Quran that highlights gender equality requires a holistic method that takes the text's historical and literary dimensions seriously. At the same time, a faith-oriented discipline such as Islamic jurisprudence is obligated to see the Quran not as God's eternal word, but as his temporarily conditioned word, since this is the only way to break with a sweeping ahistorical understanding of the statement, of its statements. Let's have a look on the verse 222. There we can read, they ask you about menstruation, say, it is very painful, so keep away from women in the state of menstruation and do not approach them until they are cleansed. And when they are cleansed, then come to them as Allah has commanded to you. Truly Allah loves those who abstain from evil and keep themselves pure. The verse belongs to a larger context with two short interruptions. The entire passages deals with aspects of marriage law. The question of when we focus not just on the verse, we focus on the context of the verse. So we can see that the context of the verse is marriage law. The question of whom may be married, permissible sexual practices, the waiting periods in divorce, and so on. The words are addressed to both. The words of these passages are addressed to both men and women. Androcentric language is sometimes used in formulation concerning divorce as well as the wedding ceremony. So the verse 222 and the next verse 223 clearly stand out in this passage, since unusually they refer to a direct question and have a reactive character. We can see at the beginning of the verse that there is written, they ask you about menstruation, say. This makes the verse seem lifted out of the passage and addressed to a specific group of questioners at a different point in time, making the discursive character emerge here very clearly, the discursive character of the Quran. We cannot say with certainty what exactly the framework for the question is in the case either, but we can use a few occasions of revelation that are talking about why a verse was revealed to trace the reception of the verse and to filter out the core elements I can just do this here on one example. So we can read in one of these occasions of revelation, Anna said, the Jews used to expel their wives from their homes during menstruation and refrain from eating, drinking, and having sexual intercourse with them. The prophet was asked by a group of men about this, and the verse was then revealed. This occasion brings out a main point of focus in line with the thematic orientation of the verse and make clear that the verse is read in connection with them. There seems to have been a practice of shunning menstruating women, both during the consumption of food and drink and with regard of sexual intercourse, which is attributed to different cultural or religious circles. The core elements of the occasions of revelation and the contents of the verse, as well as the timing of the revelation of the surah at the beginning of the Medinan period, is a very clear harmony. So the second surah here, we are in Surah 2, verse 222. This was revealed at the beginning of the Medinan period. That means when the Muslims came from Mecca to Medina. It is quite clear that they were raised question by a specific group of people, since the verse referred directly to them. As I already mentioned, they asked you about menstruation, say. What is interesting here is that this question was raised at the beginning of the immigration to Medina, but there are no other verses except 223 later verses in the course of Revelation that are dedicated to this or a similar issue. This can be
Dr. El-Omari, die Stimme aus dem Off. Bitte noch vielleicht
ich brauche nicht mehr so lange.
5 Minuten, genau.
Ja, nein, brauche ich auch. Ich bin sofort fertig, ja, das dauert nicht mehr lange. Okay. Such contact could lead to a clash of ideas, with familiar practices being subjected to negotiation and foreign practice questioned. How the verses were received, but also to some extent their content, indicate that such a clash occurred, one to which the verses are a reaction. Those, verse 222, starts directly with the idea that there should be no sexual contact during menstruation. This will most likely not be a new ruling, but an already familiar practice that is independent of encounters in Medina. But what is new here is a possible encounter with a different religious practice, one that states that women should be avoided totally during menstruation. This practice is justified in the late antiquity context on the grounds of women's impurity. The verse responds to the question regarding this common misogynic tradition by foregrounding not avoidance on account of impurity, but consideration. For menstruation is a difficult time for many women. We can here read it is very painful, and hence the injunction to abstain from sexual intercourse during the time and only engage in it again once menstruation is safely over, a moment symbolized by the washing of the whole body. We can, of course, also ask at this point why the Quran uses androcentric language to talk about the female body at all. What shows through in all the occasions of revelation is that the verse is addressed to a group of men. So is one argument. So the androcentric character is there because the questioners are men in this context, and so this verse is directed to the man, and is of course shaped by the patriarchal context in which we are. However, this should not hide the fact that patriarchal structures also shape language patterns. That means that these structures can lead to an active-passive language through which women are spoken of passive objects. For the Quran provides many such examples. A literal interpretation that reads the verses independently of their historical context and does not make any attempts to transfer their meanings undoubtedly supports, in the case of verse 222, the idea that men have a historical and divinely legitimate right of determination of the female body. However, as I have already shown, it is a task of a contemporary exegesis of the Quran to be more nuanced, to locate the androcentric language of the Quran in its historical context, and to detach the message from the language in which it is formulated. That means the verse is by no means concerned with using an androcentric formulation to control the female body, but rather with regulating sexual practice which affects both sexes equally. So Islamic law needs urgently a shift. Woman must become subject and no object, not object. So the text here is directed to men, but the issue is about sexual activities, and this means that it's addressed to both. So we have to leave the androcentric character of the speech, and we have to look behind the text. What is the reason here? And it is very interesting to see that the Quran is making here a shift from the idea of impurity and is talking about the painfulness of the menstruation. Unfortunately, we cannot find this in the Islamic law. So in the norms of Islamic law, and even in exegesis, we can clearly, in classical exegesis, we can clearly find the idea of impurity of menstruation. And this is really a pity when we can see that there is a shift in the Quran, and it is not taken serious by Islamic law and by Quranic exegesis. So what we really need in this context is that we have to understand the Quran in its historical context. So I will close at this point, and thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I really took too much time.
Thank you so much. I guess with this topic, there is never ever enough time to go into depth. So this is like an open source where you can debate forever. And yeah. I found it quite interesting when you refer to the Quran as this temporary conditioned word of God, which basically kind of, calls for the need to take into account the asbab al-nusul, so the event of when the verse was sent down, and the need for reinterpretation. And I found it also interesting to see that actually it's not only the Quran and the Hadith, which are often, the root cause or the assumed root cause for gender inequality in Islamic law, but also the need for a reinterpretation of the fiqh. So because it's a human product, and who were the exegetists, who were the legal scholars who came up with those norms? Mainly it were men. Yeah, sorry to say
exactly.
This. I think this is also a bit thought-provoking. We have already the first question received, and I will now read it to you because I think it's a very relevant question, and it reads, the question is, do we need to modernize a society that its people want to keep their regional traditions? In a recent survey in Morocco, 60% of people are against premarital sex. So it's not only about laws and practices, it's about people. Most of regimes fear to bring changes, especially in these taboo topics, to not provoke its citizens. So is it really a need to modernize a society?
Yes, of course. I mean, we have two different issues. I mean, we have Islamic law on the one hand, we have the fatwas, for example, on the other hand, which are more practical. And of course, we have thinking inside the Islamic society, which have clear understandings of moral or clear understandings of honor. Honor is a concept which is very cultural determined, not so much religious determined, more culturally determined, and it is connected with religious argument why, for example, pre-marriage sex is not allowed and so on. So of course we have a lot of discussion because in fact there are a lot of people, young people, even here in Germany we have a lot of talks with young Muslims who are in relationships and who come in the situation to have pre-marriage sex, and they cannot talk to somebody about this because they just hear it is haram. So what you did, maybe you can go to hell. So what we need are answers for this special situation, and we need to talk about this inside the Islamic theology, first of all, because we need to find answers about this. And of course, we need these changes in the society, but the society is mainly shaped by the theology. We can see this, for example, in Tunisia, where we had already some changes which are now stopped because of the political aspects there. But we had, for example, already the idea that a woman should inherit the same as men. And this was not just by law fixed and by the idea of equality, but also by the religious leader. And this is very important to get the support of religious leader who can argument with the religious sources that these changes are okay with Islam. And then the society can accept this. But unfortunately, I really see this today still very far away in Islamic society, because we have also always a struggle between the conservatives and the modernists. And as we can see in Tunisia, this is exactly what is happening right now. They already fixed ideas of changing laws, and currently they are not realized because there is a political shifts. And we have again the Muslim Brotherhood, who is supporting one of the parties, and so on. So this is very difficult on the political area.
Thank you so much. I see another question coming from Franz Winter, and then another one in the chat. Yeah, I would take those two, and then I'm afraid we have to give the word to the next speaker. Franz, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. My remark is a kind of follow-up to the question which was posed, hopefully not too critical. But my first question would be, at the beginning, you were kind of claiming that jurisprudence is not following, so to say, or not taking care of exegesis of the Quran. As a matter of fact, everyone who is studying fiqh is also studying the Quran in a traditional way. So they are very well aware of the Quranic exegetical tradition, which already has a long history. What they don't follow usually is the approach which came into being, so to say, in the last decades in the university context, which is the new approach. And this is a very small portion of the whole exegetical tradition. Which brings me, of course, to my next question, which is your interpretation of 200 Quran 2 and 200 2023. I mean, this is one interpretation of many other interpretations. Is this not a final solution, so to say, the only legitimate interpretation of this text? And everything was wrong, which was written about this text?
This was a question. Yes, first of all, this is what about the classical the communication between exegesis and Islamic law. This was exactly what I said. I said the contemporaneously understanding. As we right now in exegesis, we are using the historical method, and in exegesis, we are in Islamic law. There's still a literal meaning of Quran, and of course, in the classical exegesis, there is also a literal meaning. So there are a way of the classical methods, but there is currently already answers to gender aspects in contemporary exegesis, but they are not in Islamic law founded. For example, when we talk about divorce, right for women, and so on, we have already answers for this if we can understand the text in its historical context. But Islamic law is not accepting this method. So this is what I'm saying. There is no communication in this aspect today. I'm not talking about the history. Of course, these two disciplines are connected with each other. And I'm not saying that the reading of equality is the only way to understand this verse. Of course, I could not say that this is the only true reading. There is no true reading of any verse. Exegesis is always needs methods. Of course, I need a method. My method is very huge. I cannot explain this here in just a few words. But so my method is just one method of a lot of methods. So I can also read this as a hierarchical verse. I can understand it as much. I can understand it androcentric, of course. This is also a legitimate reading. So it depends on my premise, how I want to read the text. And of course, I can even give theological arguments why gender equality should be a goal. So it is not enough just to take a method. I have to give theological arguments in the image of God why this is my perspective.
Thank you so much for the thought-provoking questions, and Dina, for your elaborate answers. I will pose now the very last question, and I might ask you, please, to be brief on that one, because otherwise we are way over time. Okay. This comes from Iran, and the question reads, I was wondering how you might differentiate or relate when it comes to change in fiqh or Islamic legal understanding, the activism of female players in academia and traditional seminaries. Do you give a priority to one?
Between activists and academics?
Yeah.
I think this is both very important because we can see that a lot of academics are also activists, and the changes on the social area is much provided by activism, not by the academic discourse. So I mean, as I see it, it has to go hand in hand. So we need on the one hand the theological arguments, and on the other hand we need the people going to the streets and claiming for their rights, as we can see it, for example, in Tunisia. The changes in Tunisia are mostly there because of the voices on the streets and not just because of the academic discourses.
Thank you so much. And I'm afraid there are more questions coming, but due to time constraints, I apologize, but we cannot go into depth now. Dina, thank you so much. It was really thought-provoking. Without further ado, I want to introduce you now to the second speaker, which is Professor Henriette Dahan-Kalev. She's a professor emerita from the Ben Gurion University in Israel. She's a specialist in political protests and gender resistance, mainly in marginalized populations. Professor Dahan-Kalev is a Truman Institute for Peace Research Fellow at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. In recent years, her research focused on the following topics: on the complex connections between gender and economy, women protests and state institutions, on transformations in the lives of women in the Middle East and North Africa, and on political thought and religion, the gendered perspective. Moreover, Professor Dahan-Kalev is the founder of the Gender Studies program at Ben Gurion. Today, she will talk about canon and tradition, transitions, the case of gender in Israel. So we are leaving now the Islamic context and come to the Jewish one. Professor Dahan-Kalev, it's a great honor to have you with us. The floor is all yours. And a remark for the panelists, I will share the presentation of Professor Dahan-Kalev in the chat for everyone so that it's accessible for you through the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction. And I'm really sorry we are leaving the Quran, Islam, and gender, because it was a very meticulous talk. And I have a lot of questions to share with you and discuss, but maybe we'll have another occasion. I would like to first thank you, Kirsten and Lucas, for being generous and very patient with me all along the project, and bring me here to present a paper that actually made me more profound on the topic. So, as the title says, we are dealing here with the canon, tradition, gender, and Israeli society, which means that we have three axes that intersect together. And I will try to focus on the intersection and the clashes that unavoidably are raising out of or coming up of this intersection. The point is that when we're dealing with the Jewish canon, the codex of law and tradition, of course, it is similar to what Dina have presented in the tension that goes between feminist movement, contemporary feminist movement who want to liberate themselves, and the androcentric elements that actually subordinate women. And my question begins with wondering, why do people in general, and particularly women, subordinate to codex of law, to canons, to in the Jewish context, it is the halacha, that is the law and the canon, and with tradition that are subordinating women. Why don't they stand up? Now, the question, why don't they stand up, begins when we start analyzing and researching feminism, feminist revolution. Presenting these questions within the context of the Israeli society makes it very, very complicated. So I will lay some theoretical concept and work along in light of this concept. I begin by Althusser's concept of interpellation. Interpellation, as he defines it, is that there are women, that there are the people, or the citizen becomes a citizen when he or she are submitting to subordinating orders. And subordinating orders come, in this case, come exclusively from the androcentric order, at the case that women are subordinating to this canon, to these laws, to these traditions, not having any problem, Kirsten? No, not. Sorry. Okay, I'm talking to names and letters rather than people, and therefore I see this kind of movement. My concentration changes.
All is good. No worries, Henriette. You're doing good.
Okay, so going back to the theoretical concept of Althusser, the question that I pose here is why women subordinate to canons and to laws that they did not participate in and did not take part in, and yet they do feel as if they chose and they elected to submit, and they elected the laws to submit to what they are subordinated to. The feminist theory suggests two ways of contesting it when women start to ask questions about this subordinating order. And the two trajectories that I want to concentrate on are one of Simone de Beauvoir's strategy of how to cope with subordinating order when women decide to contest the subordination. And the other one is more radical, and I will go to Kristeva, Sixou, and Irigaray in order to explain the other trajectory or the other strategy when women start to clash or to contest the androcentric order. Simone de Beauvoir suggests that we have, feminists who want to liberate themselves, we have to ask for equal share in the power, equal share in governing our lives, in shaping our order of life. That means that she actually recommends not to bring up the differences, the gender differences, but rather to push them away and to ask for brotherhood in the sense of being mates for men, and not sisterhood that is different from men and make coalitions of women. So this is the Beauvoir's recommendation. Kristeva, Sixou, and Irigaray suggest a different thing. And here what they suggest is that, first of all, to acknowledge all these characteristics that attach to women, that describe women through the androcentric order, and to take these characteristics and render them a source of power. For example, shame or weakness of women should be something that women have to reconceptualize in order to show that this is a source of power. So what they have to do is to go the scripts of the androcentric founding fathers, and in this case, for example, Sigmund Freud, who defined the problem of woman by asking what is the question, what is woman, what is the problem of women. And another description is that we cannot understand women because they are like a dark continent. So Kristeva, Sixou, and Irigaray suggest that we go and take all these perceptions that describe women as hysterical, as melancholy, as insane, and reconceptualize it and render it as a source of power. Now, the question is, what happens when women take these suggestions seriously? Of course, women become agents, they become active. And when they become active, there is an unavoidable clash between androcentric order and feminist order. When we come to the Jewish canon, we are talking about the canon and tradition, of course, we are talking about 18 centuries of androcentric order. How would we suggest that women start to cope with this very, very, very heavy, overwhelming, and subordinating very, very strictly the lives of women? I refer you to the first concept, to interpellation. And now what we see is that when women try to contest this order, the point is that they cannot just strike in order to unnote the knot that is like the Gordian knot of Alexander Macedon, but the women have to move step by step in order to untie all these subordination forces. And it takes, as I would like to suggest, in the history of feminism, that it is always one woman who is crazy enough or who is in danger when her life is in jeopardy, that she starts her struggle against this order. That is, I do not attach to movements of feminist women the credit unless we have one crazy woman who starts the struggle and takes it on, putting her life in jeopardy. I use in Hebrew or in Yiddish the word meshugane. I don't know if you know it, but it takes a crazy woman to put her life in jeopardy in order to bring it to the forefront, in order to make a difference in the women's social life. It is almost like in Platon Cave, where all the people are tied and all the people are subordinated, but one woman at a time succeeds to move out to see the sunlight. And therefore, she's treated sometimes like crazy, even by her women mates. And of course, by the androcentric order. Now, I would like to stop here this theoretical conceptualization in order to talk a little bit about the canon and the tradition in the Israeli society. The Israeli society, as all of you know, is a very not only multicultural, but also multi-religious and multinational. Of course, I conform myself today to the Jewish population, although I have to say that we have 20% of Palestinians that make a difference in the sense of feminism and, of course, the Islam practicing in the Israeli society, but I don't have the time to enter it. So I'm focusing not only on the Jewish population, but only on 40% of the population in Israel, because the Israeli structure is like that. The ultra-Orthodox population form about 35 to 40% of the population of ultra-Orthodox observant women and men. Some of them are ultra-Orthodox Zionists, some of them are ultra-Orthodox non-Zionist, but they don't form all the population. The rest 60% is secular. It doesn't mean that there are no reciprocal influences between the two sections of the ultra-Orthodox and non-ultra-Orthodox, Zionists or not Zionists, but it does mean that when we start when women, feminist women start to do their move in order to make a difference, as I mentioned about a single woman, a very small group of women, then the change starts locally, and then like a stone in water, it spreads out. Now, within the Israeli society, the structure is more complicated than that. It's not only that we have religious, non-religious, and ultra-Orthodox, non-ultra-Orthodox, etc., or Zionist and non-Zionist, but we also have a difference between people who migrated, Jewish people who migrated from Arab and Muslim countries of origin, and Ashkenazim, and we are calling them Mizrahim or Sephardic, and people who come from Euro-American countries of origin. The difference between them, which I don't have time to go into, is one significant difference that I want to stress, which is relevant to my analysis here, is that the Euro-American, mostly Zionist movement leadership made it, and when the immigrants from Arab and Muslim countries came to Israel, they suffered from what I think I can describe in one word: Orientalist attitude. That is, they suffered from discrimination, they suffered from being perceived as barbaric and primitive, etc. And the result was also within the economic differences. That is, Mizrahim until the, I think, late 90s, where the lower class, the poverty of population consisted of a majority of Mizrahim and Palestinians, of course. And the problem was that there are differences between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. I hope I made it clear, because it is a bit confusing. But anyway, when I go back to see also the practice, the observance of Jewish law among Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, what we see is there is a difference between the practicing and observance of mitzvot, of halakha. On the Ashkenazi part, they are more strictly observant according to halakha and the Jewish codex, while the Sephardim, the Mizrahim, are considered more tolerant, and they are tolerant in the sense that they combine between the Jewish law and the Jewish tradition and modernization in a more flexible way, while the Ashkenazi are more rigid. And therefore, what we see is that there are differences, the economic differences, but also the codex observance differences and the traditional differences, which make a very deep cultural gap between the groups. So far, the background for the analysis that is my main points, my main point today in combining between the three axes. What happened when feminists, Ashkenazi feminists, Mizrahi feminists, ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi feminists, and ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi feminists decide to contest the canon and the traditional order of the Jewish life in Israel. As I said, one Meshuggah begins the revolution, and the Ashkenazi Meshuggah. Are you with me with the word Meshuggah? I mean, one leader, one crazy woman decides the revolution. So when we speak of the Ashkenazi woman, I take Malka Piotrkowski. In a minute, I'll give a description of her personality. And for the Mizrahi woman, I take Adina Bar Shalom. You can find the names on the PowerPoint that I distributed with the kind help of Kirsten. So what is the agenda of Malka Piotrkowski? As I said, the Ashkenazi Jewish part of population of the ultra-Orthodox are upper class. They are defined as modern ultra-Orthodox. Modern ultra-Orthodox means that the women within this population had more opportunities to acquire higher education and to be on the upper class and to struggle in order to hold and achieve positions of government, positions in the canon of government and the spiritual leadership. I don't have the time to explain how historically it happened, but it was a long struggle, historical struggle. However, Malka Piotrkowski, she is a PhD, and she acquired the halakha codex of law by learning and doing her degrees in the universities and in yeshivas and other religious institutions. Within these religious institutions, she went deeper to the canon to find out whether women are allowed or not allowed to participate in spiritual leadership, in becoming one of the judges, of the religious judges of halakha. And of course, what she confronted, or what she faced, is that the androcentric religious leadership blocked her way to become part of the spiritual canon leaders. And she struggled for this right. She struggled for this right by showing that there is nothing in the canon that stops her from becoming one part of the spiritual leadership. But the androcentric forces and the patriarchs blocked her way. She continues to struggle, and oddly enough, she is consulted by mail within the spiritual leadership when they need some kind of a new opinion or original interpretation, especially because she argues that the way women think is an addition to the understanding of Jewish halakha, and the Jewish halakha is not complete without listening to women's opinion, interpretation of the Jewish code. Now, here she is accepted as a leader, a spiritual leader, but she's not accepted as making a point or making the judgments. Her activism brought the spiritual leadership to conflict. There are some who say, some androcentric patriarchs, who say that gender is here not to go, and they cannot ignore anymore the changes. They have to take it into consideration and find solutions from within the Jewish canon. On the other hand, there are those who are strict and those who are rigid, and they don't want to allow women into this leadership. So eventually, she's not there yet, but she created a leadership crisis that the Orthodox world is actually facing and being embarrassed in many senses. But the point is that they are, the controversy put them in a crisis, and we don't have a solution yet, or the Orthodox world doesn't have a solution yet.
Henriette, you have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, thank you. It's enough. I will make it. So this is Malka Piotrkowski and the Ashkenazi feminist ultra-Orthodox women. I move to the Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox women, and I want to point to you the activism of the woman called Adina Bar Shalom. Adina Bar Shalom is the daughter of the Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Ovadia Yosef is one of those that are considered very, very brilliant minds in Canon, in Halakha, that suffered from the discrimination that I mentioned that was in between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, which is still existing. Adina Bar Shalom grew up in a political home because her father was finally the chief rabbi of the Mizrahim ultra-Orthodox Jews. And they established a very strong movement called Shas, which I don't have time to go into now, but it's a very strong political movement. Adina Bar Shalom conformed to her father's demand to raise children, to be the axle of the family, to be part of this traditional life of the Jewish community. However, she was very ambitious. And then she came to her father using a very interesting strategy of bargaining of Denis Candioti, who theorized this idea of bargaining. She came to Papa and she said, well, I think the women are working and are the breadwinning of the families, but because the husbands must go to the yeshivas and learn Torah from morning to evening. And since that, the population and the families are very poor. What I suggest, Adina Bar Shalom suggested to her father, what I suggest is that you give me a permission to open a small college for women to learn secretariat skills, to have other skills that will enable the women to be a better breadwinners. And her father approved. So she started by this little college in the religious, ultra-Orthodox religious neighborhoods. And the end was that this college expanded and flourished and made a real change. Again, I'm talking about one Meshugane, one woman who pulled all the carriage and generated the revolution. So by generating this revolution, something very interesting happened. The women became the axle, the backbone of the economic family, then the economic Mizrahi community. She moved maybe I'm exaggerating, but she moved the majority of this community, the Mizrahi community, from the below the line, the poverty line, to above the poverty line. They are not millionaires, but they are middle upper class now. Or, well, not upper class, I think I'm exaggerating, and a middle class. However, the end of this story is that male did not, on the other way, male became dependent economically on women. The women became stronger. And what we see today within this population of Mizrahim, that women even moved to the secular world of universities. We can find among them filmmakers, musicians, accountants. That is all academic skills. So the end of the story is that when one Michigan woman starts, I think we can count on her that a revolution will occur. I don't have more time in order to show you other examples, but this is how I believe feminism starts. And how, last sentence is that it is not only lives of women, of Mizrahi or Ashkenazi women are influenced, but also the secular women are influenced. Again, the codex of the law and the tradition transforms thanks to this kind of activism from above, that is bottom, that is up, down, like Malka Piotrkowski, or from bottom up, like Adina Bar Shalom. Thank you.
Henriette, thank you so much for your inspiring talk. And I guess especially your last part very much referred to the last question I posed to Tina, that it actually needs both women's activism, but then also a top-down approach in order to achieve something. And I found it quite interesting that you brought in both perspectives of Ashkenazi feminism and Mizrahi feminism. However, also, I mean, you quite aptly pointed out now the limits of this feminism when it comes to religious leadership. No, you said this brings religious leadership into a crisis, and I guess this is holds true not even for the Jewish world but also for the Muslim communities. So whenever there is activism, religious leadership interpretation gets into crisis. So just as a triggering point for another, I guess we have 10 more minutes. I'm sorry, Wolfgang, I go into a little bit more into break, and I take a little bit time of the break. I hope that's okay. But my question would then be, how then do I overcome this religious leadership crisis? What's your point on this, just to keep the discussion going? And in the meanwhile, please post your questions in the Q&A section. So how would you see this leadership crisis? How do you overcome this? And would you see female rabbis, female leaders in there eventually?
Okay, I did not have time to show you how different are the groups within the ultra-Orthodox families. That is, there are those who are in favor of changing the order. And for example, Professor Tamar Ross from Bar Ilan University, she says we can find the solution. We only have to dig deeper into the canon, into the Codex of Law of the Halacha, and we can find every answer there. The point of Tamar Ross is that the Orthodox population is not allowed to take solutions from outside. So there are those spiritual leaders, the male spiritual leaders, the theologists and the religious observants, who say, yes, we can find the solution within the halacha, within the canon. The others are saying, if we start with this, it's a slippery slope. So I think, like everything in cultural and religious controversies, they never end. They develop, they become complicated, but they never end. So sociologically, what happens is that it splits the population. And we have now a population that was never unified, but even more now split, and groups are going to different directions. Those who are in favor of Malka Piotrkowski, those who are against Malka Piotrkowski. So this is within the world of the ultra-Orthodox Jews, but I didn't have the time to discuss the state of Israel. The state of Israel, how the law, the non-religious law relate to this religious law. And this is very, very complicated field that I don't have time to go into it. But the idea is that Malka Piotrkowski gains legitimacy from the state, but not legitimacy from the ultra-Orthodox radical conservatives. So I think she gains power. While gaining power, it will be at a point impossible for the ultra-Orthodox leadership to take a decision. Again, this is a splitting decision, but who cares? Israel is a very split society. So there will be another section. That's my opinion. It's my personal position towards the situation. And those who want to liberate women should insist on that.
Thank you so much also for this insight now into Israeli society. I'm asking now, are there any other questions, comments, urgencies? I see no other question coming. So I guess I have to thank now all the speakers. Thank you so much for your highly valuable input, and for all the listeners and panelists, of course, and attendees. We have now a break until 10:30, until the final panel kicks off on interreligious education, led by Wolfgang Weira. For my part, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
To you all. My name is Wolfgang Weira, and I'm Professor of Religious Education at the University of Graz. Since the beginning in 2017, I've been part of the research team around Professor Marco in the project Migration, Integration, Religious Diversity, and have been responsible for the cluster Interreligious Learning, Islam and Christianity. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Joseph Marco for his intensive efforts in this interdisciplinary project, which brings together researchers from different faculties and disciplines. Thank you very much. Religion and education. This is the very broad topic of this last panel. In the context of religion, state, and law, both formal school education and informal educational processes are aspects that cannot be ignored. In particular, school education is a focal point where those three aspects come together and where challenges emerge as if under a simple microscope. We will hear about different perspectives in this panel. It's interesting for me that none of the four speakers chose a purely mono-denominational view. Rather, the topics of interreligious dialogue, interreligious education, the confrontation with other worldviews and religious truths, each within the horizon of a plural society, are focused in the next 2 hours. We will have 4 lectures, each of them 20 minutes, and we will have 10 minutes to discuss each presentation. And I will be very strict by keeping these times. First of all, it's an honor for me to introduce Zechariah Zedini to you. He's been teaching Islamic religious education at the School of Education of the University of Innsbruck since 2014, and he is the head of the Department of Islamic Theology and Religious Education of this university. Some of his main research fields are Islamic religious education in Austrian schools, new concepts in Islamic religious education and didactics, and especially relevant for this lecture, interreligious education and teaching principles of religion and the fundamentals of the Christian-Islamic dialogue from an Islamic point of view. Most of his publications from recent years deal with interreligious education as well. Together with Martina Kramer, he is editor of the book series Studies in Interreligious Education, with many highly relevant and interesting volumes. Zechariah Zedini will speak about the pluralistic society as a challenge for Islamic education, an Austrian example. Zechariah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak about this topic here. I hope you see my presentation.
Zechariah, we see your whole screen, the presentation,
okay.
and also the word file.
Now it should function.
Now it works.
Thank you very much. Okay, I will start to read so I can use this 20 minutes appropriately. I start with the introduction and then with the parts. Open and ideological plural societies face a variety of challenges. The multitude of shapes and forms recognizable in nature alone leaves no doubt that diversity is a constitutive feature of creation and represents a normal state. I just have to see my presentation. Nevertheless, this insight has not prevailed everywhere. On the contrary, even in liberal democratic societies, there is an increasing tendency to perceive diversity as a threat to one's own identity, which is why attempts are being made to restrict it. For religions and religious communities too, ideological religious diversity is a challenge. This is mainly because in plural contexts, different worldviews and religions are in principle regarded as equal, valid options. In contrast to pre-modern times, when certain religious traditions were legally favored over others, today they are at least legally equal in plural societies, which in view of the changed circumstances requires a reorientation of religions. Above all, it requires a revision of one's own claim to validity and truth in order to be able to meet alternative interpretations and claims with appreciation. This is by no means easy because an appreciative attitude is always at risk of being criticized as relativistic or subjectivistic. European Muslims face similar, if not greater, challenges, not because Islam has an inherent aversion to plurality, as it often claimed, but because Islam developed mainly outside the Western Hemisphere and has a different relationship to the processes of revolution and transformation initiated by the Enlightenment than, for example, Christianity or Christians who were directly involved in these processes. Consequently, the question arises as to what concrete challenges plural society poses for Muslims and how to deal with them. In this context, Islamic religious education at Austrian schools plays a special role as an important interface between religious community, state, and society, which is why this article also focuses on this. So this paper is divided into 3 sections. First, there is a brief introduction to the current situation surrounding Islam in Austria. The second section examines the question of how Islamic religious education can contribute to the cultivation of a plural society. The third and final section aims at identifying the attitudes needed to promote the capacity for plurality. Islam in the European context. Austria is one of the few Western countries, and certainly the first, in which Islam has been legally recognized and given equal status to other religious communities. The reasons for this lie in Austrian history, namely the occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1878 and its annexion by the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy in 1908. With the annexion of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the number of Muslims within the monarchy increased significantly. An estimated 500,000 Muslims lived within the borders of the Habsburg Empire at the time. In order to integrate the newly acquired population, the Islam Act was passed on 15 July 1912, which created a legal basis for the recognition and equality of Islam. After the First World War and the collapse of the monarchy, there was initially no significant Muslim population in Austria, so that the Islam Act did not receive any special attention. It was only with the labor migration in the 1960s and 70s that numerous Muslims came to Austria. Following the Act of 1912, a group of Muslims applied for recognition of the Islamic religious community in Austria. This was guaranteed in 1979, which marked the beginning of the history of the, we call it IGGÖ, Islamic community in Austria, as the official representation of Muslims in Austria. In addition to this right of representation, the Islamic religious community was given responsibility for the organization and teaching of Islamic religious education at public schools. This took place for the first time in 1982-83 school year and has been offered nationwide since then. According to the Islamic religious community, more than 600 teachers at 2,291 schools currently offer Islamic religious education to around 80,000 people. Furthermore, various training centers for prospective religious education teachers have been established, which has led to a significant overall increase in quality. But much has changed since the legal recognition almost 110 years ago and the introduction of the Islamic religious education in public schools 40 years ago. Especially the political climate in the country has been affected by major changes. While Austria was long considered a model country in dealing with Islam, the situation changed after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. As in the entire world, mistrust toward Islam and Muslims increased sharply in Austria as well. A representative study conducted in 2018 by Wolfgang Anschauer on attitudes toward Muslims in Austria clearly confirms the Austrian population's negative attitude toward Muslims. According to the survey, 72% of respondents believes that Muslims do not represent a cultural enrichment. For 70%, Islam does not fit into the Western world, and 51% are in favor to restrict the practices of faith for Muslims. In addition, 45% support the idea that Muslims should not have the same rights as everyone else in Austria. In response to the events surrounding Islam, political leaders in Austria took several measures. These reached a preliminary climax with the amendment of the Islam Act in 2015, which led to controversy because the new law was perceived as discriminatory, especially by Muslims themselves. In addition to the dispute over the content of the Islam Act, the way it was communicated and presented to the public by the government of the time was interpreted as an important sign for the changed Islam policy in Austria. In 2021, a further tightening of the Islam Act took place. The project was further accelerated by the Islamist terrorist attack in Vienna in November 2020. This turn in dealing with Islam also influenced Islamic religious education in public schools. Largely unnoticed until then, the new situation brought it into greater focus. More and more questions arose about the content of Islamic religious education, the qualification and attitudes of teachers, and the possible contribution of Islamic religious education to integration and the prevention of violence. It should be noted that in addition to the global circumstances already mentioned, the notorious misconduct of the Islamic community as the body responsible for Islamic religious education in connection with curricula, textbooks, and its personal policy contributed significantly to the intensification of criticism of Islamic religious education. Islamic religious education in Austria has been operating in this global and national context for almost 20 years. It is confronted with different expectations and challenges, which are especially owed to the current context. Regardless of different expectations, the greatest challenges for religious education in general and for Islamic religious education in particular is how to deal with and position oneself within pluralistic society. An additional change lies in the difficult current context, which is particularly characterized by a general mistrust of Islam and Muslims. The religiously motivated acts of violence in the name of Islam on the part of young people socialized mainly in Europe, and the difficult handling of religious plurality, human rights, and freedom of expression in countries with a majority Muslim populations present Islamic religious education with further contextually conditioned challenges. In view of the current political situation in Austria, two central tasks stand out for Islamic religious education in Austria. The first is dealing with and positioning itself vis-à-vis the secular democratic constitutional state, and the second is cultivating an appreciative attitude toward other worldviews and religions. The secular democratic constitutional state. If one considers that plural societies are dependent on the secular democratic constitutional state as a guarantor of ideological religious plurality, which in turn relies on preconditions that it cannot generate itself, it becomes clear that close cooperation and mutual support between state and religion are indispensable. In this context, religions are challenged in their very own interest to cultivate those values that contribute to promoting the secular and democratic framework that guarantees the freedom and diversity of different religions. The obvious advantage that the religions enjoy from the secular democratic rule of law, and from which smaller faith communities benefit the most, provides sufficient reasons to advocate for it. For example, it is highly unlikely that Islam and Muslims in Europe would be on an equal footing with other religious communities without this framework. European Muslims, whose share of the population has risen rapidly in recent years, are particularly changed in this context. This is mainly due to the widespread essentialist assumption of recent years that Islam is not compatible with Western values or with the secular democratic constitutional state. This assumption, which is spread both by Islamophobic and fundamentalist circles, suggests an incompatibility of Islam with democratic and pluralistic values and constructs a dichotomy between being Muslim on the one hand and being European on the other. According to this view, being an Austrian Muslim, for example, with democratic and pluralistic values is a contradiction in terms and therefore impossible. Such and similar ideas are spread via media, political parties, but also by religious groups, and are gaining more and more approval. This situation is particularly problematic because narratives of this kind are used by radical Muslim groups to convince Muslim youth that a democratic constitutional state contradicts Islam and that they are therefore obliged to look for alternatives. To confirm this assumption, which is not tenable from a theological point of view, individual experiences of discrimination by Muslims or Islamophobic statements by influential people, especially by politicians, but also world political events that are perceived as being directed against Islam are used. This creates a dangerous amalgam that often forms the actual basis for individual young people to turn against the plural society in which they were socialized. Young people's questions that reach us via our website, Islam Portal, further confirm this phenomenon. In view of this situation, the challenge is to counteract this constructed dichotomy through educational work in general and through Islamic religious education in particular. Above all, it is important to manage the deconstruction of this incompatibility hypothesis, which is neither historically nor theologically tenable. Numerous arguments in Islamic sources in the history of Islam, but also in contemporary Islamic scholarship, offer themselves for this purpose. Within Islamic scholarship, there is a basic consensus that Islam does not provide for a particular form of state, and that forms of state known from Muslims' history reflect the spirit of the times rather than a binding Islamic ideal to be imitated. In addition to the theological and historical deconstruction of this dichotomy, the challenge in Islamic religious education is especially to convey the essential importance of the secular democratic constitutional state for religious diversity and the development of one's own faith. For this, not only the guarantor for the unrestricted possibility of following and representing one's own conviction, but also for the free decision for or against faith, which is the constitutive component of faith in all religions. Only where there is a freedom to be for or against God can authentic religiosity be assumed. Closely connected to this is the necessity of cultivating an appreciative attitude towards other worldviews and religious traditions. This will be briefly discussed in the following part. Interreligious dialogue and on equal terms. The appreciative treatment of other worldviews and religious traditions is another important challenge we face in plural societies. In this context, religions play a central role as important social actors. Despite many similarities, it is not easy for people belonging to different religions to accept different interpretations of the world, values, and claims to truth based on their own religious convictions. Instead, competition and fear for interpretive sovereignty often prevail. In addition, an appreciative attitude toward other religious traditions is sometimes seen as a delusion of one's own religion, which does not necessarily promote dialogue. For this reason, the key to success lies in strengthening the capacity for plurality or pluralism. In this sense, pluralism refers to a reflected approach to plurality, while plurality refers to the giveness of religious or any diversity as a matter of fact. Peaceful coexistence within a plural society requires more than the mere acknowledgement of an existing social diversity. The challenge now is to reflect on the existing diversity and to generate attitudes that make it possible to perceive this diversity as enrichment. For this, certain skills and attitudes are necessary that enable socially as well as pedagogically desirable reflected handling of plurality. In this context, Muslims are currently facing a double challenge. On the one hand, there is a need to counteract the idea of clash of civilization and thus also of religions, which is becoming increasingly difficult in view of the attacks on people of other faiths by radical Muslim groups. On the other hand, it is a matter of revising outlandish theological concepts for dealing with people of other faiths, but also with people who do not identify with any religion, and developing new concepts based on the inviolable dignity of the human being and the corresponding rights. In order to initiate an appreciative and accepting dialogue, it is necessary to critically examine and relativize one's own claims to truth. This does not mean indifference toward the claims of one's own religion, but rather an awareness for one's own finiteness and fragmentariness, as well as of the fact that truth ultimately always surpasses human imagination. To believe in God with full conviction also implies the recognition of God's unavailability and the diversity of paths that lead to him. Closely connected to this is the attitude to the question of salvation. Acknowledging the possibility of salvation outside one's own religion, or at least not excluding it, is an important prerequisite for an appreciative dialogue. Those who see themselves and their brothers and sisters in paradise and other people in hell will find it difficult to regard religious plurality as enrichment and as a normal state of affairs. In this context, it is important to develop a contingency-sensitive attitude. This means, among other things, knowing that something can also be different from what it appears to be and being comfortable with the fact. For Islamic education, this means a necessary intensified engagement with different worldviews and religions. It is of enormous importance to comprehend these alternative worldviews in their own self-understanding and to recognize that they represent a path to salvation for their followers. In addition, it would be advantageous to explore within the framework of Islamic religious education those areas where a common approach would be beneficial to all. In this regard, there are several topics that could be addressed, such as sustainability or environmental protection. It is therefore
there are 2 minutes left.
I need only 10 seconds. In this, therefore, important to tap into the positive potential of religions to advance important issues that are in the interest of all citizens. Thank you for your attention.
Zakaria Sedini, thank you very much for these insights into the specifics of Islamic religious education in Austria. I now open the floor for questions to the speaker. Who wants to break the ice and wants to start? I see already 2 questions in our Q&A board. The first is from Michael Kramer. Thank you, Professor Sedini, for your lecture. My question: which Muslim philosophers and which Islamic teachings do IRE teachers have to deal with in their training in order to achieve the attitudes you mentioned, in order to promote pluralism? How can the dichotomy between secular and religious values be resolved in the best way? To whom should Muslims refer with regard to social cohesion and religious diversity? 3 difficult questions.
Above all, it's a very long question, but I mean, there are several, and Michael knows these people. There are many intellectuals made this work. I mean, maybe they didn't work directly with the topics of Islamic religious education, but the problem between the secular state and Islam in European or in Western context, there are many scholars who had made some researches in this field. For example, one of my favorite is Fazlur Rahman, but there are also many other like Muhammad Arkun and other intellectuals who have many ideas about how to deal with it in the modern time. But it's true that we don't have so many intellectuals in the field of Islamic religious education, especially who did deal with this problem. How can the dichotomy between secular and religious values be resolved in the best way? I mean, I have to say, the best way is to deconstruct this dichotomy, as I said, because these are some constructions. Even when I spoke now, it's a construction when I say Islam and Europe and Islamic values. Which Europe we mean when we say Europe? Which values? Western society. Which Western society are we talking about? Is there a Western society that everybody has the same value? But I just use this to make my point. So I think that if we understand it rightly, there is no necessity to be a dichotomy between secular and religious. I think the lines between differences don't lie between religion and secular or some religions, but mostly the differences are mostly between the way of the people are thinking. For example, I can have many common values with people who are not religious, who don't believe in anything, or who are secular, or who are Christians and Jews, than with some people who are Muslims or even scholars. So the differences are not between secular and some religions, but they are, I see the differences between the ways we think and we see the world. But what we Muslims have a special problem, that's my perception, is in Europe especially, that the dichotomy comes when the secular state and religion they try, how to say it in English, it's a problem. So when you compare between state and the religion, but if you separate them and see the state as the secularity of state as a normal situation, I think that the dichotomy can be distracted at that way. To whom should Muslims refer with regard to social cohesion and religious diversity? To their sources and to their intellect. I mean, there is no other way. So we have to see the reality and try to interpret our sources in our time.
Thank you, Zakaria, for a complex answer to complex questions. There's another question from Christoph Rode concerning the university system in Germany, but also in Austria. And he writes, recent attempts to establish liberal chairs for Islamic religion, like in Münster, have failed. When I talk to Muslims, then they are not prepared to accept, for instance, Muhammad as an object of investigation. It is not allowed to examine qualities holy person. They say that this is not allowed. The Quran does not allow a critical examination of its own origins, and Islamic researchers do not question their own resources. That is a huge problem. Do you have any idea how we can integrate Muslims in the positivistic scientific discourse? If a critical examination of sources is resistant, then you have no ground for any fruitful discourse. The same problem is with fundamental Christians in Alabama and in other countries, I think. And he writes, it is a bit too generalized about Muslim scholars, but that is only because I want to make the point.
The same thing as I made when I spoke about it, but I think it's a problematic. It's problematic to say, for example, in Münster, we have an Institute for Islamic Theology, and it failed. So who says that it failed? They have more than 1,000 students there who are studying, and they published. I mean, what is the criteria to say that it failed? And we have in Münster, and we have in Erlangen, we have in Innsbruck, in Vienna, we have in Berlin now, in everywhere. So I mean, that's the problem. We just take narratives that somebody is speaking about, like here in Austria, when some politician says the integration is failed. So nobody asks which integration is failed. So what is the problem? I think it didn't fail, and I think that Muslims have here in Europe the critical view at the university, and is dealing with the critical investigation of own source of Prophet Muhammad, and what we do not do, and I think the Christians also don't do. We don't examine whether he was a prophet or not. So because there is nothing to investigate, you can believe or not, but all others, what comes with Quran and Hadith and everything, what we call theology, is investigating, and not only in Europe. We have many intellectuals all over the world, in the USA and other parts, who are investigating this, and it's also not something modern. We have scholars, also medieval scholars, who have a very critical approach to the Islamic theology and Islamic theological issues. So maybe you had more contact with people, and we have this group of people who do not want this kind of thinking in Islam, and it will always be a group like that. But our challenge is to distinguish and to say a group of Muslims doesn't want the Islamic theological critical thinking, but there is also a big group of Muslims who don't have any problem with this critical approach to the own Islamic religious tradition. And also we have many Muslims who are in the scientific discourse. For example, I want just to say that's our perceiving of the reality. For example, one of the two persons who work on this vaccine, BioNTech Pfizer, I don't want to make its adversion, but is a Muslim female. And I don't know whether she practices or not, but that's not so important. She is as a Muslim there, and there are many others. So also we have a group that doesn't take part on the scientific discourse, but it's not the greater part. And I think that the establishment of institutes, Islamic institutes in the European countries, especially in Austria and Germany, have a contribution to the way we are dealing with our tradition in a European context. And I don't think that these chairs were established for a liberal Islam, but the main objective is to think Islam from a European perspective, to think the Islam from the perspective we are living in, and not to import an Islamic interpretation from a different context.
Okay, Zakaria, thank you very much for this differentiated answer. I think it's you have a reply from Christoph Roder, but then I think we'll have to wind it up. As Christian, I'm ridiculous because I believe in the bodily resurrection. In theology, I am out. There's always a private and the public dimension of faith. Thank you for your answer. Okay.
Thank you too.
I think we can leave it. Thank you very much, Zakaria. We'll step to the next lecture. Our next speaker in the panel this morning is Mohammed Abunimah. He's professor at the School of International Service in International Peace and Conflict Resolution at the American University in Washington, D.C. It's the largest school of international relations in the United States. Beyond that, he's senior advisor to the International Dialogue Center KAICIID, an international organization that is specialized in interreligious and intercultural dialogue, still in Vienna, I suppose. He's an international expert on conflict resolution and dialogue for peace, with a lot of years of teaching experience, especially in courses that deal with different aspects of peace building and conflict resolution, with a focus on faith-based peace building and interfaith dialogue. One of his most important publications is entitled Interfaith Dialogue, a Guide for Muslims. Interfaith dialogue is also the topic in his book, Unity in the Diversity. Mohammed Abunimah will talk about interreligious dialogue in a pandemic reality between priority and luxury. A warm welcome to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Wolfgang. Thank you very much for hosting me, and it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. Is the voice clear? Can you hear me? Excellent. Thank you.
Very fine. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm delighted to be part of this conversation because also Dr. Zakaria presentation, I will build on it and relate to it because it's I think made my conversation here on 3 levels. One, I'm going to explore the engagement with the religious actor or with religiosity by policymakers, mostly in European context, because as you mentioned, I am with the center in Vienna, and it's still in Vienna at least until the end of this month, and then it will be moving to Lisbon. And maybe that's at least a gesture or an indication how the local domestic politics of Vienna or of Austria dealing with interreligious dialogue and diversity. That's a big, I think, a decision that hopefully intellectuals and policymakers will reflect on it, of not having enough space in the pluralist Austrian context to accommodate such an enterprise or such a center. But from there, I want to reflect with you on my engagement with policymakers in European context and also elsewhere regarding the engagement with religion, and then look at some possible some of the experiences that we have seen in terms of dealing with the COVID crisis, based on this notion of can we engage with a religious leader? Our religious leader have any role to play in such situation? So, I mean, obviously there are positive changes in engagement of religion and policy making, and those changes are very clear. Just to name a few of them, there is more recognition of the potential role of religious leaders in the managing of a humanitarian crisis. CAICID, PAR, the GLI, Religion for Peace, Network for Traditional Leaders are some of the few mega networks in the world today that deal with these issues. Also, there are enough evidence, empirical evidence and data that points out to the significant role and contribution of religious leaders, especially on the community level in terms of their intervention in a crisis situation. A joint learning initiative is a good platform that you can look up for some of the research that has been done in this area, the Berkeley Center in Georgetown as well. There is also more inclusion of women and youth in IRD, interreligious dialogue, and also in religion. You can see that in the number of women who participate in many of these events as speakers, as organizers, and also setting the global agenda for interreligious dialogue. You just look at the leading 10, 15 interfaith dialogue group organization, and you can see that. And these are the trends in the past at least 10, 15 or 20 years as I see it in the field. On the technical side, we have more guides, manuals, books, and research on this part. So the field of engagement of religious leader is growing, and of interreligious dialogue is certainly growing. That doesn't mean there are no challenges and problems. There are many of those, especially in a European context, secular European context. In my view, like Dr. Zacharias spoke about, the assumption there that, the problem is within the Muslim community or Islam or within the religious community. But I think that's partial. The problem also exists in the fundamental assumptions in a secular state system, as in Austria or European Union in general, where we're still dealing with 4 types of responses to the question, will you engage with religious actor, whether it is in education, in health, in environment, or in any other theme, of course. And one of the first reaction is usually for this: no, we don't need religious from politicians and government. No need for religion. There is no special role for religious actors in diplomacy or in international relation or in policy in general. We will dictate and we will determine, and they will deliver, because it's not essential according to the perception of these policymakers. And that's I call the denial stage. There's another stage where people, politicians, governments as well, and public officials, and also education administrator, they will engage with religion because they recognize it, but they recognize it in a symbolic way, in a ritualistic way. So you invite an imam, you invite a rabbi, you invite a Buddhist monk or a Catholic priest, invite them to the event, invite them to recite a few items from their faith, and then you check the box and say, I engage. It's not really serious engagement in dealing with the crisis or in dealing with the problems in general. And then there's a third level of engagement, compartmentalization, where you say, okay, religion is important, religious actors are important, religious identity is important for many people in the world. At least 84% of the global, according to the Pew survey, global survey, have a religious and a spiritual affiliation. So in your organization, with this European Union or OSCE or ODIHR or United Nations or any of these big major intergovernmental policy or even government, you have one person, Professor X or Professor Z, in the government in charge of Islam or in charge of religion, and that's compartmentalization. We did that for many decades with women, and we said the gender is important, and here we have one woman in the entire organization, and she will be in charge of dealing with gender. If you have a problem with women, you go to this lady, or you go to this black person, or now you go to this Muslim person who will be in most cases Muslim, but even in France and other countries, he or she doesn't have to be Muslim. They can be also non-Muslim, teaching and dealing with issues regarding Islam or regarding religion in general. That's the compartmentalization approach. Limited the resources in dealing with religion. It still does not treat religion as equal and religiosity as equal to other ideologies, to the ideology of secularism. And then you have the fourth, where you have full integration, full mainstreaming of dealing with religious identity, religious actor in all policy level. And that is very little example we have in the world today. Most of the companies, most of the governments are dealing with the compartmentalization approach if they are in that stage. Unfortunately, we have, as Dr. Zakaria said, during the past 20 years, due to many stereotypes, Islamophobia and other issues, we have regression in the way we deal with religion in Europe and in a secular context. Allow me to go into this. The problem again is not only, as I said, it's not only in the policy, but it's also in the religious institution themselves. So to be not only balanced, but to give the full picture. In the religious institution themselves, when we approach them to say, let's talk about education, health, environment, let's talk to the policymakers, we found that there is no institutional and sustainable structure for the engagement with the policymaker. The Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Al-Azhar in Egypt, or in Mecca and Medina, in Saudi Arabia, or Zaytuna in North Africa, many of the major, or Al-Muhammadiyya in Indonesia, if you wish, or in Nahdat al-Ulama as well. We found out that many of these major religious institutions in the world and also in Europe have no institutional structure to sustain conversation with policymakers. They're not also ready to deal with that. In many ways, they were not necessarily, even some of them were not necessarily seeing the value of the benefit of engaging with policy. Some even said, you know, this is contaminating. We're spiritual, we have a different role in the world, and dealing with policy and politicians is always a trouble, is always a problem for us. Second issue, domination of male representation in that leadership. Every time we work with interreligious dialogue and gathering on a high level especially, we have 99% male domination, because in the Christian Judaism and also in Islam and other faiths, Hinduism and Buddhism, the male domination on leadership continue to exist as well. Government agency continue to control the religious authority and dictate many of its positions. And this is clear if you look at the southern hemisphere, especially how muftis and imams, and as well as clergy from a Christian denomination, and even a Jewish, and to some extent, are controlled by the government and in many ways by the authorities to issue declaration or to conform to the policies that the government agency wanted, and even security service. And in some ways, unfortunately, the French, the German, you know, Dr. Zakaria mentioned the different centers, and unfortunately, some of these centers are created in order to shape Islam according to the policies local European politicians who wants to define Islam from a secular European, and in some cases even a Christian set of values of what a religion is about. And unfortunately, there is a debate right now regarding the validity, credibility, authenticity of this so-called Islamic interpretation from the government perspective, rather than from the clergy or rather from the community and the intellectual themselves in Europe. Again, we also have the formal and informal religious authority. With whom do you go? Do you go with those who represent the church, or you go with those who are in social media and the cable TVs and the informal religious leadership? That's fairly powerful, at least in the Muslim world and the Christian world as well. You really, who's the gatekeeper of the faith? Are they the formal mufti and patriarch, or is it also people who do social media, religious social media, or religious education, but informal way? The last challenge here is at the risk of engagement in conflict intervention. When we try to tell the religious group leaders, please work with us on these conflicts, they said we're not protecting, it's not safe, and government is not providing us with the necessary support. These problems exist every time we have this intersection or interaction between government and religious leaders in any field, including education, including environment, including health. And that is, in many ways, is major crisis in the engagement between these two entities and areas. We'll take an example, the COVID crisis. I took it because it's a health issue, and I compare it to war zone area, limited resources, limited mobility, risk of health and lives, and distrust. There is uncertainty. We don't know where this is going and how it's going to evolve, and limited information supplied by different people. And as individual, you feel the risk of losing control over your life, and therefore it's very hard for you to to have any certainty in this situation, and you need the help. The question, where do you get the help? And obviously, religious leaders should have a role in responding to such situation. And to what extent policymakers from the World Health Organization to the United Nations, to European Union, to governments as well, engage the religious leader, engage the religious authority in responding to this situation. some of the responses, the challenges in responding to COVID-19 from an interreligious perspective is that it increased the fear and suspicion of other group. It increased xenophobia. We have exclusion or stigmatization of different group, Muslims in India or marginalized group in European context, poor people who don't have access to economic with low socioeconomic status have been stigmatized in the society as well. There have been restrictive rules and unjust in order to accept these restrictions in order to deal with the pandemic or with this war situation that we have or violent situation we have. And we accepted that in many cases. There's some demonstration against this are more growing in different parts of Europe as well and the US. Breakdown of inter-ethnic and inter-religious relation in a fragile context. Again, when the inter-ethnic, inter-religious relation are fragile in general in the context of war zone, if you talk about Libya, if you talk about Lebanon, talk about Pakistan, in India, Kashmir, many places, and also in the European context due to the rise of the right-wing discourse. In these situations, the inter-ethnic, inter-religious relation were affected by this pandemic, this, right now lockdown in Austria. Imagine how little interaction there is in terms of interfaith relation because of this situation. Some people began theologically saying our doctrine can save you. If you are a true believer in Islam, a true believer in Christianity or Judaism or any of these exclusive doctrines were introduced. Logistical challenges of keeping apart in terms of the virtual access to it, dismissing cross-community interaction. We don't have time now for cross-community interaction. That's not as important. And there was a big shift in funding. Donors are not as interested in interreligious dialogue during the pandemic. They shifted to more essential aspect that they have. And again, the adaptability, versus something tangible that need to be done. Despite that, we had some good example of recommendation and practical example where IRD, interreligious dialogue, was operative and was working in that sense. By the way, this is all based on a survey with over 150 fellows from all over the world that we surveyed during the pandemic, and we asked them, what are you doing regarding IRD, interreligious dialogue, in your context? 3 phases in responses among the religious community. I want to survive first, so I deal with my family and starting with a closer family. And this is the shocking initial phase, from March probably until end of the year 2020. Phase 2, I need to begin think of my community of the follower. How do I deal with them? How do I provide support? How do I allow worship places? How do I access to other resources to help my community health? And only in phase 3, when interreligious dialogue, people began talking about, okay, it's not only me in this crisis, not only me in this war. My survival is dependent on other faith group, and therefore I need to reach out to the people outside of my community and try to ask the question, how can we deal with that? And maybe this is what Dr. Zakaria referred to, the dealing with the diversity of the other the relativism in the approach. We are a diverse society and we are interdependent on each other, and we need to be cooperating and coordinating our response to the violence, our response to the crisis of health. Otherwise, it will affect us. And we're seeing this is perfect example what's happening with the recent variant in Africa. The North thought they are safe if they got their own vaccination, 3 vaccination, and we neglected to deal with this in the African continent and other southern hemisphere. And suddenly we find ourselves beginning to restrict back, and now some countries giving massive donation of vaccination to the south. Similar, this is exactly now we woke up and say, okay, Europe cannot survive this without Africa being dealt with or cared for in this context. The same exact dynamic took place in interreligious dialogue as well. Number of questions in dealing with IRD, but I'm going to skip to the actions taken by religious leaders. Joint statement, expression of solidarity were made, calling for government to take measures and also to comply with the measures were done. Private sector promoted interfaith actions, but intersected with health or integrated with health, engaging with the creativity and energy of young people, women, men, network were reached out to through interreligious efforts in order to engage and work against the pandemic spread. Develop interfaith tool guidance to address the pandemic and its challenge. We did this manual, but many other organizations also work in this area later when they begin dealing with interfaith dynamic. Hold interfaith online consultation, webinars, provide regular doses of optimism. Again, the spiritual, optimistic belief, the moral compass that faith group and leader they try to provide during this pandemic. Develop social media campaign, again, to advocate for compliance with this. Move interfaith ritual online and other creative. So dealing with this online issue. The reality, we all began dealing with IRD online. I am really after 2 years of working online on interfaith dialogue, after 28 years of working physically face-to-face, I have a serious doubt about relationship building, and genuine interfaith dialogue relationship over virtually. Webinar is good for information, for intellectual exchange maybe, and for technical exchange, but for interfaith dialogue to be transformative and internalize this shift in perception, I think it requires more than the virtual, and the virtual is limited. We are still struggling in the field of interreligious dialogue, how we are going to deal with this issue and whether this virtuality reality is possible in doing that. And I will conclude in 2 minutes, Wolfgang, if you allow me. Again, many guiding principles to taking clear stand, create a culture of inclusion, express empathy, strengthen charitable and services effort. These are all guiding principles we came up with and identify in working joint interfaith dialogue in responding to the pandemic or to the crisis. Adapt behavior, approaches, methodology, and technique to strengthen resilience. People were feeling weak and not as resilient. So what can make people be resilient and how can you help with that? And also to build consortia and coalition. Any work against a pandemic, against a crisis, against violent extremism has to be built on coalition and the joint work rather than one faith group or one government, one agency trying to fix it all for everybody. So this multi-faith encounter, multi-faith approach is crucial in this reality as we discover. I mean, maybe a couple of words on conclusion. The dealing with the interfaith and also for education, it's the same principle. The principle of interdependency and interconnectedness. In any given society, if we do not educate for that, and we cannot, if we don't also implement it in our approach to the other, our efforts will remain to be less effective and less accepted by those who are different with us, even if we have the best intention towards the other. Still, the open and the joint communication, open and joint work together to face these challenges is the key, rather than one group or dominant secular or Christian or Muslim try to dominate the discourse and impose on the other their will in how to deal with the crisis, because they are the dominant group. Thank you for your patience and listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abunimah, for your very interesting insights to your work and to your considerations. I think that one of the great challenges is how religions will work in the face of current polarization and radicalization. The floor is opened now for your questions. Max Lakic is the first.
Thank you, Dr. Abunimah, for your intriguing presentation. So if I understand correctly, the conclusion is more or less that interreligious dialogue does not work as it could or should via video conferences, etc. But that would only be a problem if at the same time the hostilities, the religious hostilities between religious groups would rise at the same time. Do you have any data regarding the rise of hostilities within the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you. Again, I didn't say it does not work. What I said, there are certain aspects of it are more effective and other aspects are less effective. So the transformative internal processing of perceptions and the change, it's very hard to do it until over virtual space. But the technical part, the information exchange is possible. The ritual is possible. To give people hope through virtual and social media is possible. So we need to be more nuanced in what do we mean by interfaith dialogue when we deal with it, and I think that's limited. There are plenty of data you can find in Joint Learning Initiative website. You can find in the website of CAICID. You can find also in the website of the Berkeley Center in Georgetown reports from on xenophobia, on religious stigmatization, on Islamophobia as a result of the pandemic. And also, we've seen that in India and many other places where small minority were marginalized. Indonesia, stigmatized on that. The seclusion, anyway, separation and seclusion will increase suspicion and will enhance the sense of distrust of the small community. But there is plenty of this evidence and these sources I mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I see Manfred Piena is raising his hand.
Yes, thanks also from my side for this instructive and very stimulating talk. I wanted to bring in also maybe a counter experience as to interreligious dialogue. I was part at the beginning of the year in an adult education digital seminar. And that was aimed at bringing together Christians and Muslims from a rather rural area in Bavaria. And we had breakout sessions then in the Zoom rooms, and the people were able to talk to each other about their personal experiences with faith and so on. And at the end of the session, many Christians would say, as a feedback, this was the first time that I had a personal conversation with a Muslim or a Muslimah. Why is that? Because Muslims are in a minority situation, and you find many places in Bavaria and many cities in Bavaria where you would not have the opportunity to encounter Muslim citizens. So for me, that was an interesting experience, and I thought maybe the digital communication can promote interreligious communication that would not otherwise have happened. And I wonder if you have experiences like that as well.
Yes, thank you. Probably, again, to reiterate, yes, you can do that. And in contact theory, this is a typical response or reaction interpretation for this. In contact theory, when groups for the first time meet, there is this excitement of learning about the other, knowing the other, especially if they come from the dominant majority who did not have a chance to meet with the minority. That's pretty much exists, and maybe Zoom allowed people to do that more freely and widely. However, that's one aspect of interfaith dialogue. I was referring not to the first stage, I was referring to the full experience of developing sustainable relationship and developing joint action together, identifying common themes and acting in order to exercise the change that they have. As a first step, what we call awareness sensitization. Yes, Zoom will do the job, and maybe we'll do it in a safer way, because it's far more safer for somebody to be antagonistic and have lots of stereotypes and meet with the other on Zoom rather than face-to-face and physical. That's even more intimidating and require more energy for people to travel in that. So yes, it's possible. It's useful for first step of of sensitization and awareness. But again, let's not be, in my view, let's not call this a full interfaith dialogue and interreligious dialogue. This is one segment, and sometimes it's even used as an excuse by the dominant majority to say, yeah, I did the dialogue and it did not work. They don't want. And there are many evidence in the field and research of a contact theory program and encounter that support this possible development. But yes, please continue and do that. It's great to do anti-sensitization and awareness. However, I would say, let's do the work of interreligious dialogue in a more systematic way in education and also outside of the education.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was a great conclusion for your talk. Thank you very much, Mr. Abunimah. Thank you for your experience, Manfred Piena. And now it's up to you. I'm very pleased that I can introduce to you Manfred Piena. He holds the chair of religious education at the Friedrich Alexander University of Erlangen-Nuremberg and is director of the research unit for public religion and education there. Furthermore, he is co-director of the Competence Center of School Development and Evaluation, founding member of the Center of Human Rights, Erlangen-Nuremberg, and associated member of the Bavarian Research Center for Interreligious Discourses. We heard about it. Manfred Piena pursues a number of research fields. The most important are human rights and religion in educational contexts, interreligious and intercultural education, and public theology, religion, and education. Titles of recent book publications are, for example, an empirical study on religious education teachers, human rights of children and youth in the school context, religious education as subject of content and language integrated learning, a representative opinion poll on the school subject of religious education in Bavaria, or last but not least, public theology perspectives on religion and education. In his lecture, Manfred Piena will speak about religion, human rights, and education in pluralistic societies, revisiting John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas. I'm pleased that you are making an important contribution to this Congress. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm glad that you invited me to this wonderful conference. I'm glad to be part of it. And I will share my presentation now with you. So you should be able to see it now. Okay, and as you will find out, I will concentrate on the theoretical perspective now, a more conceptual perspective maybe, but I think it ties very nicely into that to the perspectives that Zachariah has developed, and also what we've heard in the last presentation, maybe. I think the key of a beneficial coexistence between the different religions in a society is a convincing conceptualization of the relationship between common political values and religious values and perspectives. And I find that for both John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas and their concepts are very helpful. Let me start with the question that is at the beginning of John Rawls' political liberalism. How can citizens who remain deeply divided on religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines can still maintain a just and stable society? This is a question that is more pressing than ever. And A piece of evidence of this urgency can be seen in the fact that the German Bundestag initiated a nationwide research institute for social cohesion, endowed with a budget of 14 million euros, that started its work in June 2020. Of course, we agree that the reasons for social disintegration, polarization, and divide are manifold, but growing cultural as well as value, worldview, and religious diversity certainly describes one important factor. Now I want to inquire about the role public schools play in this context. Public schools, on the one hand, mirror society with its problems and challenges, but on the other hand, they hold the potential of functioning as catalysts of social change. In this way, laying the basis for a more peaceful and beneficial coexistence. John Dewey coined this phrase of an embryonic society, schools as embryonic societies. This potential of schools has to do with the fact that in public schools, children and youngsters encounter a variety and heterogeneity of fellow human beings that they will hardly encounter in other areas of their life worlds. I want to argue that for both society in general and for public education in particular, human rights recommend themselves as extremely helpful points of reference and orientation that can promote social coherence and a humane way of living together. Why do they have this potential? Because I think they are a product already of an international exchange and of an international consensus. And therefore, they recommend themselves also for an internal national consensus and a framework for internal national discourse. To be more precise, this potential is connected with what I call a pluralistic understanding of human rights. And maybe I could add now that it is a multicultural understanding, alluding to yesterday's talk by Tariq Madood. I'll come back to that later. A pluralistic understanding of human rights that is open to diverse religious and worldview interpretations. Based on the political philosophies of John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, I think you can argue that human rights in this sense can serve as a foundation for and a catalyst of fruitful communication and collaboration across cultural and worldview differences. Human rights hold this potential in their three dimensions as codified international conventions, as the representation of a consensus in fundamental values, and as a framework of public discourses. And therefore, my conclusion is that human rights education should receive more attention in public education context in general and in public religious education in particular. Now, of course, I have to be very short in 20 minutes, so I will only very briefly remind you of the basic arguments of John Rawls, because I take it that most of you also are familiar with his concepts of public reason and overlapping consensus. I have tried to visualize his main thoughts in a graph. So now my presentation is gone. Do you still see it?
We see a submission,
screen, but we don't see your...
We see it, but at the very moment we see a submission for a higher salary.
Okay.
To the dean.
Okay, yeah. So somehow
now it's the program of the
program broke down somehow. I don't know why. Never happened before, but you always have a first time. So I'll just have to find it again. So I'll stop here and start it again. It's very strange. Never happened before. But anyhow. Okay, now I'm back. And you should see my presentation again. Okay.
See your presentation, but I think you stopped your camera now.
Okay. But you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay.
That's fine.
That's the most important thing. I don't know what happens today.
No
there are all these things that have never happened before, but anyhow. Perhaps now. Yes. Now
it works.
Oh, okay. Sorry for that. Okay. I'm back to this graph. As you may know, Rawls' first answer to his question, how social cohesion is possible, is pointing to what he calls public reason. So arguing, reasoning in the public sphere. And he speaks of these common basic values or common political values that you can find a consensus on just by finding them plausible, by finding them reasonable, without referring to your what he calls comprehensive doctrines, without referring to religions or worldviews. So that is the first answer. The second answer of John Rawls is that the societal consensus significantly gains breadth, depth, and stability if, in addition to this more freestanding justification, only relying on reason, and challenged by it, the political conceptions can be linked to different comprehensive doctrines and shown to be compatible with them. And so you get an overlapping consensus of different religions and different worldviews. And I've tried to make clear with these arrows that this is not an overlapping consensus that is just the result of an empirical stock taking, so to speak, of different religions and worldviews in order to find commonalities. But the religions also are challenged by the already existing common basic values into an overlapping consensus that has not existed in this way before. And also, of course, the different religions are allowed to or are challenged to bring in their own contributions into this public sphere, into the discourse of public reason, and to find this consensus on common basic values. You can see that I have inserted human rights values here as, for me, the most prominent and the most helpful common political values that shape our societies and that shape also international discourse. Now, Jürgen Habermas based his thoughts mainly on John Rawls' model. He agrees with Rawls that the societal consensus merely as a modus vivendi, in which citizens accept political concepts or values only for pragmatic reasons and irrespective of their worldviews, is not an ideal basis for a beneficial coexistence. Rather should religious citizens have to acquire the secular legitimation of the community on the premises of their own faith. And in this way, we could say that in Habermas' German context, the two big churches in Germany, the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, in the course of the 20th century, have come to approve of and support liberalism and democracy, which they formerly opposed. Such a change of mentality, Habermas argues, cannot be prescribed or legally enforced, but is at best the consequence of a learning process. However, in Habermas' view, such a learning process is also necessary on the part of the non-religious citizens. Do not, he asks, the same normative expectations that we direct towards an inclusive civic society prohibit a secularist denigration of religion just as much as, for instance, the religious rejection of equal rights for men and women. Consequently, Habermas advances the concept of a complementary learning process of religious and non-religious citizens. The central idea is that both sides, secular reason and religion, should become self-reflective and aware of their restrictions so that they develop a willingness to listen to each other, take each other's contributions to public discourse seriously, and eventually also learn from one another. For his own philosophical discipline and agnostic position, Habermas has repeatedly advocated openness to learning from religious traditions and positions, and he has argued that the special articulative power and semantic potential of those traditions when it comes to vulnerable forms of humane coexistence have not yet been exhausted. Such learning processes should also be facilitated by the constitutional state because it must be in its interest to conserve all cultural sources that nurture citizens' solidarity and their normative awareness. I've already pointed to the fact that there is quite a closeness that I feel between my understanding of human rights in this context and Tariq Moudud's understanding of human rights. He called it a multicultural understanding. But I have the feeling that based on Rawls and Habermas, you might say that it's taking the understanding of human rights in this context a little step further, maybe. Maybe we can discuss that afterwards. In this perspective that I've just developed, it is not just about the state working to include people, include minorities, for instance, but to know that the state depends on people and depends also on the contributions of diverse worldviews and religions. And rather than the question, what can we offer Muslims that they don't feel alienated, the questions would be, what can Muslims offer to our society? What do they contribute to the common good and to a human rights culture that we can appreciate? So very briefly, the third point, human rights and public theology in the framework of Rawls and Habermas. This pluralistic reading and understanding of human rights mirrors itself in the Christian concept of public theology, a theology that understands Christian faith as contributing to the common good from a Christian perspective. And we had quite a big conference in Nuremberg in 2018, where we also had participants, Muslim theologians and Jewish theologians, who referred to this concept of public theology. So it is also a concept that is open to inter-religious perspectives. But my argument here is that such a perspective and such a concept of theology, and I think Zachariah also alluded to a similar perspective from Muslim Islamic theology, ties in this framework that I've developed, referring to John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas. We'll only shortly refer to this global network for public theology to indicate that this is a worldwide movement, and is also based on a journal, International Journal of Public Theology, where you can follow the discourse in this field. Now, this has consequences for school, for religion in school, and this will be my last point: religious education and human rights in public schools. From the framework, it is quite clear that public schools should be open to religious and worldview diversity, just as the state and as society should be open. And they should not be understood as secular in a narrow sense. Religious education at public schools can make then valuable contributions to human rights education and to a school culture that understands itself as human rights oriented. And I will try to exemplify this point with regard to young immigrant refugees that I have done a study about. It is the task, of course, of public schools to familiarize young immigrant refugees with fundamental rights and values that underpin our society at German or Austrian schools. And it has been empirically proven in a number of studies, and also in our study, that migrants tend to be more religious than the average of the German population. Therefore, it is important and also promising if on the one hand they learn, for instance, in a Christian or Islamic religious education class at school, that not religious values and but religiously and ideologically neutral, and in this sense, secular human rights and basic values apply as the highest norms in our community. This would be the one task that religious education has in this context. But on the other hand, they will learn, get to know approaches and justifications and supporting interpretations of these norms from their own religion. They are thus encouraged to discover that human rights and children's rights are fundamentally compatible with religious values, that they should, in addition to other reasons, therefore also be supported and promoted from religious motives, and that tensions between human rights and religious values challenge a self-critical rethinking of certain faith positions. So while in a school subject like ethics that we have in Germany, that is conceptualized as mainly secular and philosophical, such children and young people would have to leave their religious convictions at the doorstep, so to speak, these are taken seriously, their religious convictions are taken seriously in religious education and included in values education or human rights education. RE thus contributes to the integration of adolescents, you might say, with their religion and not without or against it. And this way, religious education contributes to cultivating reflective, tolerant, and mutually appreciative forms of religious and secular beliefs. And as I've been trying to show with this example, especially for students with migrant backgrounds. Thanks very much for your attention, and here are some books for further reading.
Manfred Piena, thank you very much for your brief and elementary summary of the concepts of John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, and for your concept of a pluralistic, multicultural understanding of human rights and religious education, or in religious education. I think the conversation between Zacharias Edin and Manfred Piena would be very interesting now, as both have represented quite similar options. We have a first question, just a moment, from Daria Kotova. On a secular end for a change, terrorism experts are in a discussion over rare, on the contrary, not so rare school shootings, I think. Terrorism charge in Michigan in the case of the recent shooting, Michigan school shooting. It is not a political statement for change or a threat to group to call for change, but in current US environment, inclusive gun violence and school shootings, even rather than domestic threats of the right-wing extremes, what is it then today? In context of public schools as mirror of society and catalyst of social change, where are we in consensus on common basic values? The question, which are those values? Manfred Piena.
Thanks very much for this question and challenge, of course. I mean, as Europeans, we tend to point to the United States and say, well, there is this radicalization as well in the Christian, as well in the Islamic field. It has to do with the lack of religious education, public schooling. And maybe this would be an important task and an important chance to have more of religious education in US American schools that is pedagogically and theologically grounded. And they could, of course, also promote interreligious dialogue in a more substantial and more a longer term perspective. So I wonder what you would think about that, and what your personal experience is about the discussion going on in the United States. I follow that now and again. This discourse on whether religion should be more substantially integrated in public schooling or not.
Okay, thank you very much. Josef Marco has raised his hand.
Yeah, thank you for the possibility to raise a question pretty much along the same lines as we had a discussion yesterday already with Tariq Moudoud and Mikhail Antonov. What is liberalism all about? When we speak about the liberal values as the basis for human rights and human rights education, as far as I can see, there are at least 3 different liberalisms. which I call the very individualistic liberalism, where individual human rights and freedoms are always given priority over all other concerns. Then secondly, you have what we call in a European context, not in an American context, but in a European context, the liberal egalitarian variety, which would allow also for affirmative action measures by in the application of the equality principle. And thirdly, and this is now the big question, is how do you see the relationship between liberalism and multiculturalism? And this was one of the criticisms of Tariq Moudud, as far as I understood yesterday, to say, well, all these liberalisms do not recognize religion as a public good, in particular the French variety of republicanism. In this regard, liberalism and multiculturalism have to be seen as opposing ideologies. And then my question would be, when we then start to talk about the meaning of freedom of religion, either from the liberal egalitarian or liberal individualistic perspective versus the multicultural perspectives, then we have immediately a discussion about the dichotomy of individuals versus group rights. And group rights are basically denied by all varieties of liberalism. So where is the overlapping consensus then? And as you can see also from the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, in the Refah Partisi case, when Refah Partisi was banned in Turkey, this was upheld by the European Court of Human Rights with the basic argument that Refah Partisi was arguing for legal pluralism in Turkey, under the meaning that not only the Turkish secular legal system, but also Sharia should be given a chance to be applied, legally speaking, and that Sharia is not, this is now the sentence from the reasoning of the court, that Sharia is not compatible with the values of the European Convention on Human Rights. So, so what about human rights? Yeah, do human rights have a common value basis, or yes or no? And I think when you look into the case law, even the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, and the narrow majorities in the Grand Chamber of the European Court, then you will see that even within the judges of the European Court of Human Rights, there is no overlapping consensus.
Maybe we
thank you.
include the question of Christoph Rode in the Q&A forum. He asks, how do you break Rawls down to a realistic anthropology? I think it goes in the same direction.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for these critical questions. I agree with you that the human rights discourse, of course, is also witnessing contesting of human rights now and again. And of course, there is a quarrel about how you understand human rights in the correct way. On the other hand, I would think that there is a potential of the human rights discourse and the human rights norms to intermediate between liberalism and multiculturalism. And that what I was aiming, what I was alluding to with the notion of a pluralistic understanding of human rights. And as far as I perceive the human rights discourse, there has been some development into overcoming one-sided individualistic positions. And also the discourse that we had in mainly in the 70s and in the 80s on Asian values and how they would be open to human rights values and how could they endorse them, has led to a kind of truce, I think, in my perception. So that there are not so many people anymore who would say that human rights are only individualistic. They are always also socialistic, if you like. And The other thing is that I see a potential in human rights, especially because they have been endorsed by so many countries in the world. They are a reference point, a normative reference point, even by many states that have a majority of Muslims or that are Islamic states. So whether they really follow the norms of human rights in their own societies is still another thing. But I think the potential lies in that you have a reference point where you can that you can use as a frame for the further discourse and for also political contestation. And so, well, returning to an internal, to a national perspective, I would also say that also draw our attention to the fact that in a recent opinion poll, 99% of the German population said human rights are very important or are important for our living together. And that is quite an amazing thing and quite an amazing consensus, a societal consensus that is there. Of course, if you ask the people, how many human rights do you know? You will find that they are not so familiar with human rights, you know. But yeah, but this basic approval and this basic positive attitude is something that we can see as a potential also for promoting them in public education, I think.
I would like to raise a last question. My question would be, based on your reflections, what consequences would you see for the organization and conception for religious education in schools in future? How could we organize that?
Yes, thank you. That's an interesting question. Actually, I think if you take the John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas framework, it strengthens the position that every religion should bring in their own contributions and their own perspectives into the realm of public education. So I think from this basis and also from a human rights perspective, there are many arguments that would counter the view that there should be one religious education subject for all. But I would not go so far to see a kind of prescription in the kind of model of religious education you have at schools. I would rather see that there is an obligation that on the one hand side, every religion should bring in their internal perspectives in order to contribute to society and contribute to also common values on the one hand side. And on the other hand side, there should be more exchange and more dialogue and more learning from each other in the sense of Jürgen Habermas' complementary learning processes. And I think that can actually happen with different structural models of religious education. And I think the kind of structural model you have should also take into account the specific circumstances, the regional circumstances that are predominant in different regions of Europe and also in different regions of Germany, for instance.
Thank you very much. I think it would be very interesting to discuss further here, but we have to stop and at this point and to continue with the next lecture. But first of all, thank you very much for your very interesting impulses to this Congress. But now, last but not least, it's a special honor for me to introduce Andrea-Lena Hartmann to you. She's been professor of religious education and catechetic at the Department of Practical Theology and the Faculty of Catholic Theology of the University of Vienna since 2015. And she has been the deputy head of the Center for Teacher Education at Vienna University since 2018. Her main research fields are, for example, religious learning and religious education in the plural society, subjective concepts, violence in family and school, gender in religious learning processes and educational institutions, and interdisciplinary subject didactics. Her latest publications are, for example, How Denominational Should Religious Education Be? Emancipation, a guiding idea for religious education or an outdated ideal. Inclusion in or through education, religious education approaches, and religious learning, subjective theories, my English, of religious education teachers. It's frozen, I think. Andrea-Lena Hartmann's lecture is entitled The Question of Truth Within the Context of Religious Plurality, a Challenge for Religious Education. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you for your kind introduction. At first, I would like to share the screen with you.
Yeah, it works very fine.
Yes, truth inherent in religion and how to address the question of truth in religion. Religious education consider religious plurality is a big challenge. Let's start this presentation with having a look at religious plurality in youth life worlds. Young people, at least in Western countries, grow up in environments that offer various choices. They can, or better said, must choose their occupation, lifestyle, political preferences, and also religious affiliation. This fact challenges education, especially denominational religious education. That leads us to how to design religious education today so as not to blur the perspective of a religious tradition on the one hand, and on the other hand, to support pupils in their decision for or against a religious affiliation, as also Manfred Piena mentioned. Religious pedagogy faces the challenge of reshaping the relationship between objective and subjective religion in religious education processes. It is necessary to keep in mind that personal faith no longer means adopting generally accepted, timeless, objective statements of truth, but is essentially determined by biographical experiences and confrontations with other people and their convictions. In this situation, we should look at recent research projects that investigated young people and their life worlds. The Signer study examined young people aged 14 to 17 in Germany. Without going into detail about the different life worlds of this study, we can say that not only social differences play a significant role, but also religious affiliation. In general, Christian young people distinguish between personal faith and religious affiliation to a greater extent than Muslims. For Muslims, religion plays a more significant role in their self-concept. They report more often than other young people about religious practices. Also, young Christians speak positively about their religious affiliation. They repeatedly relativize its significance for themselves. Others should not perceive them as religious. Also, denominational affiliation plays a subordinate role. They generally associate themselves with Christianity. A study by Schweitzer and others also discovered an interesting detail. Only a good fifth of the respondents described themselves as religious, but almost twice as many as faithful. In this context, it is essential first to clarify what young people mean by faithful. It obviously differs from what we in the scientific community associate with faithful. Young people don't think of a confession based on certain beliefs, but refer more to a fundamental trust in God, the world, nature, or in themselves. That indicates a strong distancing from religious institutions, which, however, should not be confused with disinterest in questions of religion. Young people address existential life questions, but their thematic priorities differ. And these differences are related to religious affiliation and social belonging. Oh. Sorry. Yes. No. So Dörte Vierecke investigated the meaning of religion in the life world of socially disadvantaged youth. She noted that these young people have very ambivalent, contradictory, or unrealistic ideas about shaping their lives and dealing with religion. They dream of an ideal family that provides core resources like love, protection, trust, and harmony, often contrasting with their own experiences. That goes hand in hand with the elementary ambition to become a good human. In the conceptions of their future, we find a tension between realistic and non-realistic desires, like dreams of a life in luxury, future stardom as a singer, actor, or athlete, and so on. The unrealistic ideas harbor a high frustration potential. The perfect family image is also reflected in the religious beliefs of those whose faith in God is unbroken. God gives meaning to life, protects and brings order, and one feels accepted by him. The desire to be a good human corresponds to the religious longing for a good relationship with God. In contrast, many doubters complain that God has not helped, which disappoints them badly. Others adopt an indifferent attitude towards God's existence because one cannot prove it anyway. Young people often address the theodicy question, but remarkably abstract and without reference to their life worlds or structural injustices. Magical and popular religious beliefs have become very important, notably in coping with crisis. At the same time, they reinforce threatening and frightening aspects of people's life and once again evoke experiences of powerlessness and helplessness, arbitrariness and violence. Sorry. We can sum up with Dörte Vierecke, religiosity is simultaneously alternative draft and mirror of life world structures. Since religious ideas are highly individual and have little ideology critical potential, their role as a coping strategy for social disadvantage remains ambivalent. Maybe free prayer can become a resource for managing everyday life. On the other hand, people's counter experiences find no place in the religious self and worldview. This partly idealized view remains highly fragile and is hardly sustainable in crisis. These young Christians' religious ideas and practices show that they are less interested in a religion dissolving boundaries and creating more freedom, as the efforts in other life world milieus might suggest, than in a religion of order. In their chaotic, orderless lives, they look for religious rituals, symbols, and teaching that can help them order and structure their lives. belonging to and being embedded in a religious community can also be essential for gaining recognition through participation. Muslim youth closely associate religious practice with their personal lifestyles, yet from different positions. Some consider themselves Muslims, but distinguish between religious practice on the one hand and the modern youth culture on the other side. Others are more traditional. Their orientation on divine commandments and prohibitions like halal, haram establishes boundaries and order in their world. These studies show impressively that religious plurality is spreading between and within religions and social and cultural contexts. The central issue is the question of a good life connected with different hopes and potentials for realization. All this poses significant challenges for both religions and religious education. Sorry. Yes. The question of truth in religious educational processes. I would like to start with two remarks. At first, from a subject's perspective, the search for truth is not about multiple truths, but about the one truth. But we will never be able to possess definitely and in its entirety. Second, the religion's interpretations of reality generate no supramundane knowledge about another world, but a different worldview. Any certitude of truth arises from the awareness of encountering something outside oneself. This religious perspective contains self-relativizing knowledge that transcends the human being. It's an indispensable condition for the dialogue with other religions and different worldviews. Already Zechariah mentioned. In the wide range of worldviews and religions, truth claims also compete. Pluralistic societies require intense reflections on the different interpretations of reality and the associated question of truth. Not least, this is necessary to counter fundamentalist violent efforts that aim to preserve a particularly limited understanding of reality. The question of truth is exhausting and uncomfortable, as it requires that familiar basic religious and theological concepts be modified to become understandable in their respective contexts. As a process that constantly must commence anew, will never be complete. Instead, it perpetuates traditions. It's the task of education to arouse and keep awake the question of truth. In religious educational processes, one should pay less attention to verbal confessional structures than to everyday life. In this case, religious education will not negotiate the one truth about God and human life that we call epistemic truth. In concrete religions with different understandings of world and reality, it is more a matter of existential truth leading to a life out of a truth that finds its expression in a confession. People may share elementary questions of their respective life worlds across religious boundaries. However, the way they are asked and answered will be very different. Concerning religious education, we must bear in mind that at first, religious education takes place in a melange ranging from individualization on the question of truth, like everyone can believe what they want, to the leveling of differences, we all believe in the same God, to exclusive truth claims, my God is the one and only. And second, Religious education takes place in a pluralistic world. Thus, it must consider the pupils' religious plurality and their different cultural, societal, and social resources. These are complex challenges for religion teachers. The first step, as Friedrich Schweitzer states, is to clarify the understanding of truth. It doesn't involve a conceptual, but an existential truth. That means finding out the existential significance of what is considered true and if it will prove itself. The aim is not to assert one's truth claim over others, but to recognize the otherness of the others. It is necessary to accept that one cannot finally understand the other, nor strive to integrate them into one's own view of humans and the world. Clarifying one's understanding of truth with the associated recognition of the other is necessary for developing the skills for dialogue and handling conflicts, which one acquires in a long and sometimes arduous learning process. Jan Wopova points out that dealing with different and sometimes contradictory truth claims requires multiple shifts of perspectives. Firstly, to perceive the different approaches to the world with their respective understanding of truth, like scientific, aesthetic, philosophical, etc. Secondly, to acknowledge the divergent paths to face in the respective individual religion. According to Wopova, multi-perspectivity and interweaving perspectives must become a consistent guiding principle of the didactics of religion. Furthermore, controversy resulting from a didactically orchestrated interweaving of perspectives spurs the question of truth and leads to a deeper understanding of the world and oneself. Finally, a change of perspective generates knowledge and enables a different way of looking at things. Sorry. But this isn't as easy as it sounds. Religious education needs sensitive handling of the religious views offered to the pupils and those views pupils themselves bring in. Related to the second point mentioned above, which addresses the different resources of pupils, an important question would be whether religious education affects the worlds of marginalized, socially disadvantaged young people, or merely offers ignorant knowledge that stabilizes the power of a particular milieu. We must be aware of the fact that teachers belong to the middle class. Their language, beliefs, and lifestyles are closer to pupils from the same milieu than those from disadvantaged backgrounds. An awareness for privileges and power aims to recognize that privileges not only disadvantage those who have none, but the privileged themselves. Privilege can limit one's self and world perception. However, ignoring the world and self-interpretation of socially disadvantaged youth and their religious expectations may prevent them from becoming sensitive to suffering and injustice. In the Christian faith, it constitutes an essential condition for following Jesus and gives the message of God the necessary seriousness. When the rich man cannot enter the kingdom of heaven, as stated in Mark 10, verses 25, it is not only for his wealth, but for the associated privileges that block his view and access to the kingdom of God. For religious education, dealing with socially disadvantaged children and youth is a beneficial but also challenging school for unlearning. For that, we need to brush previous concepts against the grain to see who they privilege and what gaps and develop opportunities remain unrecognized. May I give you an example? Subject orientation is a common keyword in religious education. But what does subject orientation mean for young people who are strongly determined by others because their financial and social resources impede their development to an autonomous subject? From their perspective, purely individualistic subject concepts require critical scrutiny in terms of lacking solidarity in their implications. In this case, teachers need the capability to multi-perspectivity. Subjecthood, which only receives recognition through performance, success, and possessing, rather than the inalienable dignity of man, needs to be unlearned. In contrast, it is necessary to reinforce the notion of subjectification, which addresses the interplay between social conditions and the personal wishes for living one's life. The tension between autonomy and heteronomy is a big challenge for religious educational processes. Reflecting on this can open ways for those who currently lack recognition as subjects and in their self-determination. And those who perceive themselves as autonomous subjects could realize that economic or political interests influence their striving for autonomy. We need to ask who and what prevents subjectification. It oscillates between self-determination and heteronomy. On the one hand, it refers to the contingency of subjecthood and, on the other hand, to a dynamic process of subjectification. This process takes place in dependence on and responsibility for others. In this, religious truth can prove itself and become existential truth for the less privileged as well. The next challenge for heterogeneous learning groups is designing learning processes and deciding which interventions and stimuli to set when. Young people who have already formed their denominational or ideological convictions need more irritating intervention impulses than marginalized young people involved in hierarchical struggles with others. But how can we support the latter? Here the role of the teachers comes into play. What they do matters. If they can offer a stable, reliable relationship, pupils will feel recognized in their selfhood. Through their religious affiliation, teachers can provide access to resources that pupils would otherwise not have. Their structure-giving behavior can provide order and security so that pupils do not have to develop their identity by setting boundaries against others. Based on a reliable relationship, they may learn to live with plural perspectives without losing their grip. Religious, cultural, and social diversity requires a concept of religious education that offers pupils a reflexive learning environment. We are only at the beginning of this journey. We do not yet know how to deal with the given diversity in the classrooms, with students of different religions and worldviews, socially privileged or not, searching for life in autonomy and freedom or in order and security. We have good concepts. However, in terms of implementation, we are only at the beginning. I'm looking forward to discussing this issue with you. Thank you very much for attention.
Yeah, thank you very much for your differentiated empirical insight into recent research findings on the topic of youth and religion, the question of truth, and the challenging for religious education. Above all, what does subject orientation mean in the face of disadvantaged young people? The floor is now open for your questions again. The last round of questions. Manfred Piena.
Thanks very much for this stimulating talk. And of course, I agree with your analysis. I wanted to make the thing a little bit still more complicated by bringing in a developmental perspective, and I wonder what you say about that. To my experience, the tendency of young people to try and find order and orientation in, for instance, Christian faith has much to do with the phase that they are in, with the developmental phase they are in. So you discover now and again that that youngsters who are in the age of 16, 17, 18, they would tend to a kind of evangelical faith rather than to a more liberal faith. Why is that? Well, because it is more concrete, because it provides more orientation as referring to the truth. You can be more sure what the truth is in an evangelical way of perceiving Christian faith. So in my personal experience, I also had this phase. When I look back on it, I can say it was an important phase for me. And I got beyond this phase only actually after my high school time. So I wonder how you perceive that, this challenge also, that there may be a certain tendency in the young people to look for a certain orientation that has to do with their own developmental desires and the developmental tasks that they experience. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, you mentioned already, it gets more complex. Yes, quite right. I think in some stages of their lives, it could also be a sort of experiment, I think, yes, to try to prove what does it, if religion gives you order, you will prove it, is it stable or not? And I think for me, it's a question how to act, how should the teacher act? Yes, because I think if teachers, I would make a difference. It's really complex because if you come from a disadvantaged background, maybe, yes, you're looking from to an order from another perspective. If you are coming from a background where you have a wealthy surrounding and so on, because there are others aims. In this one case, you are looking for an order that you can manage your life. In the other way, maybe it's like an experiment. Yes, you will prove if it's, and so on. And I think that's very difficult for the teacher to decide what the pupils need. Yes, and so I think it's a challenge. Sometimes we have concepts, but we don't need how it works in the practice. Yes. And so sometimes teachers mention, oh, I don't know how to cope with this. And so I think maybe we can aim this, that we relate the science with the teacher in the practice in a special way, like to do, I don't know the word, what Claudia Gärtner is stressing, this design-based research. So yes, maybe that's a way that we can do in future to initiate design-based research, so we can develop concepts with the teacher and not just on the green table. Yes, And so, and reflected and so on, because I think, as you mentioned, it's a very complex thing, and you cannot keep in mind all the different things. Maybe it's not a good answer, because it's creating a more complexity, as you brought in, your thoughts you brought in.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I do not see any further questions now, so
all people are tired.
Excuse me?
All people are tired now.
I think that's okay. So once again, many, many thanks to all 4 presenters on this panel. I think the relevance of education at the interface of religion, state, and law has become really clear. Now it's my job to hand back to the conference chair and thus to Joseph Marco for the final remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wolfgang. There is just one question in the question and answer section to you now by Michael Kramer, and maybe you can answer that directly in the channel.
I tried.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, then we have to come to an end. It was a very fascinating tour d'horizon through all these questions of state, law, politics, psychology, education, and in the end also, of course, philosophical questions about truth claims and what else. I have to thank first and above all to all of you, to all of the participants. Many, many thanks for your readiness to participate in this conference organized here by the University of Graz and the 2 faculties. And therefore, I have also to express my thanks on behalf of my colleagues of the organizational team, Wolfgang Weira, Franz Winter, Max Lakic is visible now again, as well as Kerstin Wonisch, who is sitting in Bolzano, Bozen, at the EURAC, the European Academy in South Tyrol. And I have also to thank the IT team of the European Academy in Bolzano for all the technical support they have provided. Many, many, many thanks to all of you. Many thanks in particular also to Professor Abunimah that he raised up very early this morning. Unfortunately, and this was one of the problems almost at the very end, before the start of the conference, that we had to decide. No, the conference is only possible to carry out on the internet. There are no possibilities for Ahmed Kourouga to come from San Diego to Graz by plane, or any other difficulties for traveling. So the reason for that we had to reshuffle basically more than 2/3 of our initially planned panels is also the cause why you might think, or some of you might think, that the topics within the panels did not really fit together. So our priority in the end was really to make it possible for you to participate despite of all the time differences with the American East Coast and the American West Coast. And in the case of Professor Abunimah, we were not quite sure where you will be, in Vienna or in Jordan, as you mentioned before, traveling in the Middle East. But we are very happy that you finally made it, and many, many thanks to you also for getting up so early in the morning. We have to also thank, of course, our financial supporters, the Ministry of Science, since we have come to an end now for this 3 years of project. And I think we made a big step forward with this conference. In the very beginning, we were basically trying to collaborate at the university level, that we expand and train our interdisciplinary skills, as you could see from the presentations and the questions we raised, and also to start to collaborate with our Austrian colleagues, in particular also Professor Sedini. And now we have reached the final state that we have even an almost global outreach with this conference for this project. And this brings me, of course, also to the question, what will go on? First and above all, we have also to thank many of you, many participants, that they have submitted already their manuscripts in time, their papers in time, so that we are in the very process of editing these manuscripts. Some of you are still missing, and we definitely would like to have you in the edited volume, all of you in the edited volume. Therefore, I really beg your pardon to remind you about the deadline again, and that we are that we have this contractual obligation to hand in the manuscript to the publishing house Brill by the end of January, which of course requires an editing process in advance. So this is begging you on the one hand not to forget the deadline, on the other hand, of course, a threat. If we are not able to deliver in time to the publishing house, I have to apologize in advance that your paper will not be included in the final publication. Having said that, we can expect then finally that Brill will take another, for the printing period, will take another 4 or 5 months, so that we expect the publication of the edited volume in the middle of the year 22. And in the end, I have also to thank, of course, also our other collaborators here at the University of Graz, in particular also my colleague Lukas Waldl, for all the support he gave, not only during and before the conference, but that he's also very heavily involved to the editing process, which will take some time until the end of the year, as far as I can see. And of course, we have a lot of collaborators also within the respective institutions of the Faculty of Theology. And therefore, I hand over again to Franz Winter and Wolfgang Weira to support my thanks to their collaborators and colleagues. Wolfgang, would you say a few words?
I think it's very important. Thank you also to Ulrike Bechmann, who chaired one panel, and she's an important member of our faculty and of this Congress.
Yeah, Franz, you would like to
Actually, the most important thing was said already, namely Ulrike Bechmann, who was also participating at this conference and was chairing. And thank you very much for doing that. And it's my pleasure also to say thank you to you, Joseph, for inviting me, actually, because I came at a rather late stage. I was not an early stage member of this whole process, but I was very happy to get accepted for the organization, but also for the publication process. And it was an absolute great pleasure. And of course, my special thanks also to Abunimah, whom I invited. Thank you very much for joining us, and sorry for the troubles, actually, for getting up so early today, but your contribution was very interesting, and thank you very much for that.
Yeah, then we also got a question finally with regard to the video. And I can promise that since the entire conference has been recorded and you have agreed also to make this publicly visible, so that we will put the entire video of the conference onto the homepage of the EURAC Academy in Bolzano on the one hand, and on the homepage of the Institute Department for Global Governance at the Law Faculty of Graz. So I think this would be a very, very helpful tool also for further reach out. And in this regard, I have also to say thank you to all the participants who followed us on the stream. Yesterday we had almost 20, and even at the very moment I see there are 29 participants still following our conference. And I really do hope in the end that this is not the end of the story, that the end of the conference is not the end of the story, but that we have developed new ideas also for future research and future collaboration, not only among the participants here at the University of Graz, but also with our international colleagues, and that this was a fruitful exchange, a first fruitful exchange of ideas. I have learned so much from the conference, being basically a lawyer and trained political scientist, but dealing with all these religious education issues made me aware how important it is to get a much broader perspective. And in this regard, many thanks again to all of you, to the participants on the stream, and I hope that we can bring one or several of you for a next event to be organized in the coming months or years at Graz University, so that we also have the chance then to meet each other in person after the end of the Corona crisis, which was very troubling, not for all of us, but for many of us. Thank you so much again. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your participation. And have a nice weekend in the end, despite of these very, very intensive 2 days of the conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your sharing and your hosting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.